Duke Cassian Raventhorn stood alone in the northern throne room while ministers whispered poison behind closed doors. They wanted him gone, replaced, erased from the line of succession like a mistake written in wet ink. But men who ruled through fear rarely vanished quietly, and Cassian had spent 20 years teaching the aristocracy one brutal lesson. Survival belonged to those willing to destroy everything rather than surrender an inch. Tonight, someone would bleed for their ambition. Stay with me until the end to see how a monster turns betrayal into a throne built from his enemies' mistakes. And if you're watching from London, Paris, New York, or anywhere power demands your silence, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments because this story was written for you. The Great Hall of Blackthorn Keep smelled like old stone and older blood. Cassian sat motionless in the carved oak chair his father died in, one hand resting against the armrest where blade marks still scarred the wood. Candles burned low along iron sconces. Outside the arched windows, snow fell across the northern territories in sheets of white silence that buried roads, villages, and the bodies of men who challenged Raventhorn authority too publicly. Across from him stood 3 ministers dressed in black velvet and political ambition. Lord Alistair Greaves spoke first. His voice carried the rehearsed confidence of a man who believed titles protected him from consequences. Your Grace, the Council has grave concerns regarding your governance. The Northern Territories require stability, not the brutality that defined your father's reign. Cassian didn't move. He studied Greaves the way predators study wounded prey, calculating exactly how much pressure it would take to break something vital. Brutality, Cassian repeated slowly. Is that what you call keeping supply lines open during the worst winter in 50 years? Or perhaps you mean the treaty I negotiated with the mountain clans without surrendering a single acre of crown land? Minister Aldrich Voss stepped forward, his gaunt face tight with barely concealed contempt. We mean the executions, Your Grace. 12 men hanged in the courtyard last month for what you called treason. The Crown grows weary of explaining your methods to Parliament. What is eins? The third man, Lord Edwin Crowley, cleared his throat nervously. He was younger than the others, ambitious but not yet stupid enough to forget that Cassian Raventhorn had killed his first man at 16 during a border skirmish that left 30 soldiers bleeding into frozen mud. The Council believes the Regency period might serve the Duchy better, Crowley said carefully. Temporary oversight while you adjust your approach to leadership. Silence filled the hall like smoke. Cassian rose from his chair with movements so controlled they appeared almost mechanical. He was not a large man by warrior standards, but something about the way he occupied space made rooms feel smaller, air thinner. He walked past the ministers toward the window overlooking the courtyard, where those 12 men had swung from ropes beneath winter stars. Treason, Cassian said quietly, his breath fogging the glass. Do you know what they confessed to before they died? None of the ministers answered. They sold grain shipments to southern smugglers, while northern villages starved. Children died because grown men decided profit mattered more than loyalty. He turned slowly, his gray eyes reflecting candlelight like polished steel. I hanged them in public so every merchant in this territory understood the price of betrayal. That's not brutality, gentlemen. That's governance. Greaves shifted his weight. The Crown sees it differently. The Crown, Cassian said, sits in a palace 300 miles south, where winter is an inconvenience instead of a death sentence. I don't govern for men who've never watched families freeze because someone stole their food supply. I govern for the people those criminals would have killed. Voss's thin lips curled into something resembling a smile. Noble words, Your Grace, but the Council has already drafted the Regency proposal. We simply require your signature acknowledging the transition. Cassian walked back toward his chair, boots echoing against stone floors. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood behind it, hands resting on the carved wood with casual possession. Let me understand this clearly, he said. You 3 believe you can walk into my fortress, accuse me of incompetence, and expect me to surrender authority because Parliament finds my methods distasteful? We believe, Greaves corrected, that cooperation serves everyone's interests. Sign the proposal, and the transition occurs peacefully. Refuse, and the crown will have no choice but to intervene directly. The threat hung in the air like a blade. Cassian smiled. It was the expression men saw before violence arrived without warning. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to threaten a man in his own home. Stupidity too, but courage nonetheless." He moved around the chair with predatory ease. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return to the capital and inform the council that Duke Cassian Raventhorn declines their generous offer. You'll explain that the northern territories remain stable, prosperous, and absolutely loyal to the crown despite whatever rumors reach Parliament." Voss opened his mouth to protest, but Cassian continued without pause. "And if the crown truly wishes to intervene directly, they're welcome to send armies north through mountain passes during winter storms. I promise the experience will be educational."
Crowley's face had gone pale. "Your Grace, this is madness. You cannot simply refuse." "Oh, I can refuse anything that serves no purpose beyond removing me from power." Cassian's voice dropped to something colder than the snow falling outside. "What I cannot abide is cowardice dressed as diplomacy. If the council wants Blackthorn Keep, they should send soldiers instead of bureaucrats." "Os." Greaves stepped forward, anger finally cracking his political composure. "You overestimate your position, Raventhorn. The crown controls resources, armies, alliances across the entire kingdom. One northern duke cannot stand against— "One northern duke," Cassian interrupted, "controls the mountain passes that supply half the kingdom's iron and timber. I also command the loyalty of men who fought beside me since we were barely old enough to hold swords. The crown controls resources, yes. I control survival." "Barry?" The ministers exchanged glances that confirmed what Cassian already knew. This wasn't about governance, it was about power. The council had convinced themselves that a younger, more brutal ruler should be pressured into submission, molded into something acceptable to southern sensibilities. They had miscalculated badly. "There's a woman," Voss said suddenly, his tone shifting to something uglier. "Lady Seraphina Vale. Rumors suggest you've taken an inappropriate interest in her despite her family's arrangements." Cassian's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Careful," he said quietly. Voss pressed forward, sensing weakness where none existed. "House Vale is negotiating marriage contracts with several prominent families. If you interfere with those negotiations, the council will have grounds to question your judgment on matters beyond governance." For a long moment, Cassian simply stared at the man. Then he laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You think threatening a woman I've never touched will somehow force my cooperation?" He shook his head slowly. "Gentlemen, you've revealed your entire strategy, and it's pathetic. Go back to the capital. Tell your council that Duke Raventhorn remains unmoved by threats, bribes, or political theater. And tell them if they send messengers north again, those messengers should bring better arguments or sharper swords." Greaves's jaw tightened. "This isn't over." "Judge." "No," Cassian agreed. "It's barely begun. Now get out of my fortress before I decide that hangings aren't reserved exclusively for grain thieves." The ministers left with wounded pride and violent intentions barely concealed beneath aristocratic masks. Their footsteps echoed through the corridors while servants pressed themselves against walls, instinctively avoiding proximity to powerful men during dangerous moments. Cassian remained standing beside his father's chair, listening to the sound of horses departing through the iron gates. Snow continued falling across Blackthorn lands, indifferent to politics, power, or the quiet war that had just been declared inside a stone hall built to survive centuries. Behind him, a door opened softly. "You could have handled that more diplomatically," said a voice dry with amusement. Cassian didn't turn. "Diplomacy requires the illusion of mutual respect, Marcus. Those men came here to measure me for a cage." Marcus Blackwell stepped into the candlelight. Marcus, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd earned his place through loyalty instead of birthright. He was Cassian's steward, closest advisor, and one of 3 people in the entire kingdom trusted with unguarded truths. "They'll report your refusal as open rebellion," Marcus said. "Let them." Cassian finally sat down, exhaustion briefly visible in the way he leaned back against the chair. "The council believes northern loyalty can be purchased or intimidated into submission. They're wrong. Marcus poured wine from a decanter on the side table, handing one glass to Cassian before taking his own. And the woman? Serafina Vale? Cassian's fingers tightened around the glass. What about her? Voss wasn't entirely wrong. You've been watching her at court functions. People notice these things. People notice everything, Cassian said flatly. It doesn't mean they understand what they see. Marcus studied his duke with the frankness only long friendship permitted. Do you understand what you see? Cassian drank slowly, considering the question beneath the question. Lady Serafina Vale was an anomaly inside the aristocracy. She moved through ballrooms and political gatherings with perfect composure, while contempt flickered behind her eyes like candlelight through stained glass. She spoke politely to men who treated her like property, smiled at ministers who discussed her future as if she were livestock being appraised before auction. And she looked at Cassian Raventhorn without fear. That alone made her dangerous. I see a woman trapped inside a world that will destroy her slowly instead of cleanly, Cassian said finally. The council wants to use her as leverage because they assume desire makes men weak. They're half right. And the other half? Desire makes men unpredictable. Cassian set the glass down. That scares them more than brutality ever could. Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing the truth beneath deflection. You're playing a dangerous game, Cassian. The council already wants you removed. If you actually interfere with Vale family negotiations, then they'll have the excuse they're already manufacturing. Cassian stood again, restless energy driving him toward the window. I'm not afraid of political consequences, Marcus. I'm afraid of becoming the kind of ruler who watches wolves circle an innocent person and does nothing because intervention isn't strategic. Serafina Vale isn't innocent, Marcus said quietly. She's survived the aristocracy this long because she understands the rules better than most. Understanding doesn't mean accepting. Cassian's reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. Every time I see her at those functions, she looks more like someone drowning in shallow water, surrounded by people, dying slowly, and no one notices because she's too skilled at pretending everything's fine. Marcus was silent for a moment. You're describing yourself. Cassian almost smiled. Maybe. Or maybe I recognize the expression because I wore it for years before I stopped pretending the aristocracy deserved anything except contempt. Outside, wind drove snow against the fortress walls in rhythmic patterns that sounded like distant drumming. Somewhere in the courtyard below, soldiers changed watch rotations while stable hands moved horses into sheltered stalls. Life continued inside Blackthorn Keep with mechanical precision because Cassian Raventhorn demanded discipline from everyone, especially himself. The council will escalate, Marcus said. You know that. Brr. I'm counting on it. Cassian turned away from the window. Men who rule through manipulation reveal their weaknesses when forced into direct conflict. Let them escalate. Let them send armies or assassins or whatever strategy they believe will work. I've survived worse than ambitious politicians. Marcus raised his glass slightly. To surviving worse, to making them regret trying. Cassian drained his wine and set the glass down with finality. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow we're reviewing supply reports from the western villages, and I want accurate numbers before the council tries using food shortages as evidence of failed governance. Marcus departed, leaving Cassian alone in the throne room with firelight and shadows that moved across stone walls like specters of violence past and future. He should sleep. He knew this. But rest required peace of mind, and peace had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Instead, he walked through empty corridors to his private study, where maps covered every surface and correspondence lay stacked in organized piles representing threats, opportunities, and bureaucratic noise that required diplomatic responses despite deserving nothing except fire. Among the letters sat one sealed with crimson wax bearing the crest of House Vale. Cassian broke the seal carefully, an unfolded parchment written in elegant script that suggested education, breeding, and the kind of forced composure that came from years of performing for audiences who judged every gesture. Duke Raventhorn, I am writing to request a private meeting regarding matters of mutual concern. My father's political entanglements have reached a critical juncture, and I find myself in need of counsel from someone outside the traditional channels of aristocratic negotiation. I understand this request carries risks for both of us. However, I believe you possess a clarity of purpose that most nobles carefully avoid. If you are willing to speak candidly without the performance required at court functions, please respond through the sealed channel. This letter arrived by time, as I'm certain you understand better than most, is a luxury neither of us can afford to waste. Respectfully, SSV. Cassian read the letter 3 times, analyzing every word choice, every implied meaning hidden beneath formal language. Serafina Vale was either desperate or calculating, possibly both. Reaching out to him directly bypassed every social protocol and political safeguard that protected noblewomen from accusations of impropriety, which meant she was already beyond caring about reputation. Or she understood that Cassian Raventhorn represented something more dangerous than scandal. Genuine autonomy in a world built to deny women even the illusion of choice. He should refuse. The strategic decision was obvious. Meeting her privately would give the council exactly the ammunition they needed to frame his governance as compromised by inappropriate attachments. It would validate every accusation Voss had implied during their confrontation. Cassian picked up a pen and began writing. Lady Vale, I will meet you 3 days from now at the old hunting lodge 15 miles north of the capital. The location is remote enough to ensure privacy and neutral enough to prevent assumptions about intent. Come alone, or don't come at all. I have no patience for chaperones or witnesses. If this meeting serves no purpose beyond manipulation, understand that I will know immediately and respond accordingly. If you genuinely seek counsel, I will provide it without the comfortable lies most advisors offer. Time is indeed a luxury. I suggest we stop wasting it on false pretenses. CR. He sealed the letter and left it on his desk for Marcus to arrange delivery through whatever discreet channel Serafina had established. Then he returned to the window overlooking snow-covered battlements where soldiers moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. War was coming, not the obvious kind fought with swords and cavalry charges, but the subtler version waged through political maneuvering, strategic marriages, and the slow strangulation of autonomy beneath bureaucratic authority. The council believed they could break him through pressure and patience. They were about to learn that some men didn't break. They burned everything around them first and ruled over the ashes with absolute clarity of purpose. And if that made him a monster by their definition, Cassian had stopped caring about their definitions years ago when he watched his father die slowly from poison administered by smiling ministers who called it natural causes despite the blackened veins and convulsions that suggested otherwise. The aristocracy had taught him survival required cruelty. Now they would discover exactly how well he learned the lesson.
3 days later,
Cassian rode north through morning fog that turned the forest into something from ancient stories where travelers vanished without explanation and returned, changed if they returned at all. The hunting lodge emerged from the mist like a confession, small and forgotten, built during a previous duke's reign when privacy still existed for people powerful enough to demand it. Now it served as a convenient location for meetings that could never officially occur. Cassian dismounted and tied his horse to a post near the entrance. No other animals waited nearby, which meant Serafina had either not yet arrived or had approached on foot from a different direction. He pushed open the door. She stood beside the cold fireplace, dressed in traveling clothes instead of the silk and jewelry required at court functions. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that belonged in marble sculptures celebrating beauty that survived centuries. But her eyes held something sculpture could never capture. Intelligence sharp enough to cut through the performance most nobles mistook for civilization. "You came," she said. "You asked." Cassian closed the door behind him. "Though I admit curiosity about what exactly you hope to accomplish with this meeting." Serafina didn't move from the fireplace. "I want you to tell me the truth about something no one else will discuss honestly, which is whether survival inside the aristocracy requires becoming the kind of person who deserves to be destroyed." Cassian studied her in silence. The question wasn't theoretical. It carried weight earned through experience, observation, and the slow recognition that every compromise demanded by noble society carved away pieces of identity until nothing authentic remained. "Yes," he said simply. "It does." She absorbed the answer without flinching. And have you become that person? Depends who you ask. Cassian moved into the room, maintaining careful distance. The council believes I'm a brutal tyrant who governs through fear and executes men for minor transgressions. My people believe I'm the only leader willing to protect them when winter threatens survival. Both perspectives contain truth. Neither contains the complete picture. Which perspective is accurate? The one that keeps them alive. He paused. You didn't ask me here for philosophy, Lady Vale. What do you actually want? Serafina finally moved, crossing toward a wooden table where dust suggested decades of disuse. My father has arranged 3 potential marriage contracts. Each one secures House Vale's political survival while ensuring I spend the rest of my life performing gratitude for men who view me as currency instead of a person. Aristocratic tradition, Cassian said without sympathy. Hardly unique to your situation. No, she agreed, but I find myself wondering if there are alternatives to choosing between different cages. Alternatives require power. Do you have power? I have information. Serafina met his gaze directly. My father's debts are significantly worse than public records indicate. The families pursuing marriage contracts don't know the full extent of Vale financial collapse. If they did, they would withdraw immediately and leave us completely vulnerable. Cassian understood instantly. You're offering intelligence in exchange for what? Protection? An alliance? I'm offering a partnership. She spoke carefully, each word chosen with precision. You need political leverage against the council. I need survival outside traditional marriage arrangements. Together, we could accomplish what neither of us can achieve alone. By doing what exactly? By using Vale family information to expose the corruption you already suspect exists inside the council. My father has been cooperative with certain ministers in exchange for temporary financial relief. I have documentation of those transactions. Cassian felt something shift inside his chest. Not attraction, though that existed beneath every interaction since he first noticed her at the masquerade. This was recognition. Serafina Vale wasn't drowning. She was preparing to burn everything around her and emerge from the flames, holding whatever remained worth saving. If I use that information, he said slowly, the council will retaliate against House Vale first. Your family would be destroyed as an example. My family is already destroyed. Her voice stayed level. The question is whether that destruction serves someone else's agenda or becomes leverage for actual change. Cassian walked toward the fireplace, considering strategies that bloomed from her proposal, like winter flowers capable of surviving frost. The ministers your father dealt with, do you have names? Lord Greaves, Minister Voss, and 3 others currently positioned to support the regency proposal against you. He almost laughed. The symmetry was perfect. The same men who threatened him 3 days ago had purchased their authority through schemes that would collapse under public scrutiny. And you kept this information secret. Why? Because releasing it prematurely accomplishes nothing except revenge. But if deployed strategically, during a political crisis when the council is already vulnerable, she let the implication finish itself. Cassian turned to face her completely. You understand what you're proposing. This isn't a temporary alliance. Once we move against the council together, you'll be marked as an enemy of the same institutions your family has served for generations. Those institutions, Serafina said quietly, view me as property. I stopped caring about their approval the moment I realized compliance wouldn't save me. It would just determine which man owned the cage. For several heartbeats, they stood in silence while fog pressed against the windows and morning light struggled through glass clouded by years of neglect. There's something else you should know, Cassian said finally. The council has already noticed my interest in you. They threatened to use it as evidence of compromised judgment if I interfered with your marriage negotiations. And did that threat work? What do you think? A smile touched her lips, brief, genuine, and gone before it could be analyzed. I think the council doesn't understand the difference between weakness and priority. They believe caring about something makes you vulnerable. They're wrong. Sometimes it does, Cassian admitted.
Sometimes caring gives your enemies leverage they wouldn't otherwise possess.
Only if you allow them to define what caring means. Serafina moved closer, closing the careful distance he'd maintained. The council believes you're interested in me because of desire. They're partially right, but desire alone wouldn't bring you to this lodge, wouldn't risk everything for a partnership that could destroy us both. You're here because you recognize something the aristocracy can't afford to acknowledge, which is that some things are worth burning the world rather than surrendering. Cassian felt the declaration settle into his bones like certainty forged from violence and survival. She understood, not just intellectually, but with the absolute clarity that came from standing at the edge of annihilation and choosing defiance over graceful surrender. If we do this, he said carefully, there's no retreat. The council will use every resource to destroy us. Your reputation, your family, everything you've protected by playing their game will be gone. Good. Serafina's eyes held his without wavering. I've spent years protecting things that were never mine to keep. I'm tired of performing survival for people who mistake obedience for virtue. Cassian extended his hand. Then we have an agreement. You provide evidence of council corruption. I provide protection and the political platform to ensure that evidence creates maximum impact. Together, we force a reckoning the aristocracy has avoided for decades. She took his hand. The contact lasted longer than formality required, both of them recognizing the moment as something more than political strategy. This was declaration, commitment, the conscious choice to stand against everything the Northern Territories had been built upon and dare the consequences to matter more than principle. When she finally released his hand, something had shifted between them. Partnership implied equality, trust, and the kind of absolute loyalty that made betrayal impossible, because both parties understood survival depended on maintaining the alliance regardless of cost. How long before you can deliver the documentation? Cassian asked. 2 weeks. I need time to copy everything without my father noticing the original files have been accessed. And the marriage negotiations? Proceeding according to schedule. She spoke without emotion. Lord Ashford is the current frontrunner, wealthy, connected, and completely oblivious to the fact that marrying me would link him to a scandal that will destroy his family's standing within the month. Cassian almost felt sympathy for Lord Ashford. Almost. When the evidence goes public, the council will retaliate immediately. You need to be somewhere safe before that happens. Safe, Serafina repeated, testing the word like foreign currency. Where exactly constitutes safety when the entire aristocracy becomes hostile? Blackthorn Keep. He said it without hesitation. The Northern Territories answer to me, not Parliament. Once you're inside my fortress, the council can threaten whatever they want. Actually reaching you becomes a different problem entirely. But Duchess. She studied him with the intensity of someone evaluating risk against potential reward. You're offering sanctuary. I'm offering partnership that doesn't end when the evidence drops. The council will demand you recant, claim you were coerced or manipulated into providing false information. If you're alone when that happens, they'll break you through isolation and pressure. If you're at Blackthorn, they'll have to go through me first. And what do you gain from that arrangement? A partner who understands that power without purpose is just violence wearing expensive clothes. Cassian moved toward the door. 2 weeks, Lady Vale. After that, the aristocracy learns what happens when people stop accepting cages as inevitable. He left without ceremony, mounting his horse and disappearing into fog that swallowed sound and sight with equal indifference. Behind him, Serafina remained in the hunting lodge, standing beside the cold fireplace where two people had just agreed to destroy the world they were born into. And somewhere south in the capital, ministers plotted strategies based on assumptions that were already catastrophically wrong. They believed Cassian Raventhorn could be controlled through threats and political pressure. They believed Serafina Vale was just another noblewoman trapped by circumstance and tradition. They believed the Northern Territories would eventually bend to centralized authority because history suggested resistance was temporary. Every assumption was about to shatter against the reality that some people don't surrender. They adapt, they strategize, and when pushed beyond tolerance, they burn everything rather than accept defeat as permanent. Winter deepened across the kingdom while documents were copied in secret, and fortress walls were reinforced against threats not yet articulated, but already inevitable. 2 weeks felt simultaneously too long and not nearly enough time to prepare for the kind of war that didn't announce itself with trumpets and banners. Cassian returned to Blackthorn Keep and immediately summoned Marcus. "We're accelerating preparations," he said without preamble. "Food stores, weapons inventory, loyal soldiers confirmed and positioned. I want everything ready for siege conditions within 10 days. Marcus didn't question the timeline. "The council?" Was some seats. Moving faster than anticipated, were forcing their hand before they're ready. Cassian spread maps across his desk showing supply routes, defensive positions, and political alliances that could shift depending on how aggressively Parliament responded. Lady Vale is providing evidence of council corruption. When that information becomes public, there will be immediate retaliation. I need Blackthorn prepared to weather whatever storm follows. You're protecting her. I'm protecting our alliance. Cassian's correction was automatic. She's valuable because of what she knows and what she's willing to risk. If the council neutralizes her before the evidence drops, we lose both the leverage and the momentum. Marcus studied the maps with practiced eyes that had seen too many battles to romanticize warfare. This could start an actual civil war. It could, Cassian agreed. Or it could force reforms the aristocracy has avoided for generations. Either outcome is preferable to slow strangulation under corrupt bureaucrats who mistake procedure for governance. And if Serafina Vale proves less reliable than you believe? Cassian's expression didn't change. Then I'll have made a strategic error based on incomplete information. It won't be the first time, but something tells me Lady Vale understands exactly what she's gambling and why. People that desperate don't bluff. They commit completely or they don't move at all. The next 2 weeks crawled past with agonizing slowness. Cassian attended required court functions, maintained diplomatic correspondence with allies who would matter when positions crystallized, and avoided any behavior that might alert the council to the approaching catastrophe. At a winter gala held beneath crystal chandeliers, he watched Serafina move through the ballroom with practiced grace while Lord Ashford hovered nearby like a man who believed wealth entitled him to ownership. She smiled politely, danced when required, and performed the role of grateful potential bride with skill that would have been impressive if it weren't so obviously hollow. Their eyes met once across the crowded room. She touched her necklace briefly, the signal they'd arranged. Documentation complete. Cassian left the gala early, claiming northern business required immediate attention. No one questioned it. Demanding Duke departs social function wasn't news. Demanding Duke orchestrates political revolution was, but that revelation waited for a more dramatic venue than a ballroom filled with champagne and gossip. 24 hours later, a sealed package arrived at Blackthorn Keep through channels so discreet even Marcus couldn't identify the courier. Inside was documentation precise enough to destroy careers, detailed enough to suggest criminal prosecution, and damning enough to shatter any remaining illusion that the council governed through merit instead of manipulation. Lord Greaves had accepted bribes from foreign merchants in exchange for favorable trade agreements that violated kingdom law. Minister Voss had embezzled funds designated for northern infrastructure, funneling money into personal investments while villages struggled without adequate resources. 3 other council members had participated in schemes ranging from fraud to blackmail, all carefully documented by a woman they dismissed as decorative currency. Cassian read everything twice, verifying authenticity and identifying the strategic deployment that would cause maximum damage. Then he sent copies to every major newspaper in the capital, along with a letter signed by Duke Cassian Raventhorn stating that the Northern Territories would no longer tolerate corrupt governance and demanded immediate investigation into council activities. The scandal broke like thunder across a frozen lake. Within hours, newspapers ran front-page stories detailing council corruption. By evening, crowds gathered outside Parliament demanding accountability. Before midnight, 3 ministers had resigned and Lord Greaves was under house arrest pending formal charges. The aristocracy convulsed with panic, rage, and the sudden recognition that someone had just changed the rules of political engagement. And sitting in his fortress 300 miles north, Duke Cassian Raventhorn waited for retaliation he knew would arrive with lethal intent. It came faster than expected. Royal cavalry surrounded House Vale before dawn, seizing documents and arresting Lord Vale on charges of conspiracy against the crown. Serafina was taken into protective custody, which meant imprisonment under polite terminology designed to obscure violence. Cassian received word before noon. He didn't hesitate. "Prepare cavalry," he ordered Marcus. "Full battle formation. We ride for the capital immediately." "Cassian, this is exactly what they want. They're baiting you into open conflict." "I know." He was already moving, pulling on riding gear and checking weapons with automatic precision. "And I don't care. They took her because she stood with me. That makes her safety my responsibility."
She knew the risks. So did I. Cassian's voice cut through objection like steel through flesh. And I'm not the kind of leader who abandons allies because protecting them becomes inconvenient. Ready the cavalry or step aside, Marcus. Either way, I'm riding south before sunset. Marcus saw the absolute certainty in Cassian's expression and recognized the moment for what it was. Not recklessness, not passion overriding strategy. This was the Duke of Blackthorn Keep, declaring that some principles mattered more than tactical advantage, and anyone who believed otherwise had fundamentally misunderstood what made him dangerous. "I'll ready the cavalry," Marcus said quietly. "But Cassian, this changes everything. Once you ride against the crown directly, there's no walking it back." "Good." Cassian finished arming himself and headed for the stables where horses already sensed approaching violence. "I'm tired of walking carefully around institutions that deserve to burn. Let's see if the crown has the conviction to fight for corruption as hard as I'll fight for the woman who helped expose it." 200 cavalry assembled in Blackthorn Courtyard under iron skies and northern banners that had survived centuries of warfare. Soldiers checked weapons, secured armor, and prepared for the kind of confrontation that would be remembered in histories written by whoever survived to control the narrative. Cassian mounted his warhorse, a massive black destrier trained for combat and accustomed to the smell of blood. Around him, warriors waited with the disciplined patience of men who understood orders and trusted their commander's judgment, even when that judgment led directly into catastrophic conflict. "We ride for the capital," Cassian announced, his voice carrying across assembled ranks. "The crown has imprisoned Lady Serafina Vale for exposing corruption the council wanted buried. They believe taking her will force our submission. They're wrong. We're going to extract her from royal custody and bring her north to safety. Anyone who stands in our way will learn that Blackthorn loyalty doesn't compromise when threatened. It destroys the threat completely." The soldiers roared approval, and Duke Cassian Raventhorn led 200 armed warriors south toward the capital, where the woman who dared partner with a monster waited in a royal prison, unaware that her cage was about to be torn apart by someone who'd promised partnership meant protection regardless of cost. Behind them, Blackthorn Keep stood empty except for skeleton garrison and servants who understood their duke had just crossed a threshold that separated political maneuvering from open war. The aristocracy wanted to destroy Cassian Raventhorn through manipulation and pressure. Now they would discover what happened when a man who governed through fear decided. Fear worked better, delivered directly instead of implied through reputation. Somewhere in the capital, ministers scrambled to prepare defenses. Somewhere in a stone cell, Serafina Vale sat in darkness, wondering if partnership had been a beautiful mistake or the first step toward something powerful enough to survive what came next. And riding south through winter storms with cavalry at his back and absolute conviction in his heart, Duke Cassian Raventhorn stopped pretending politics could solve problems better addressed through the kind of violence that made kingdoms remember why some men ruled while others simply obeyed. The siege of the capital was about to begin. And this time, when the Duke of Blackthorn Keep arrived demanding surrender, he wouldn't accept anything less than the woman they took and the complete dismantling of every institution that believed cages were acceptable as long as they were decorated in gold. The capital appeared through morning mist like a wound carved into landscape, all stone towers and political ambition stacked against winter sky. Cassian rode at the front of his cavalry column, 200 armed warriors moving south with the mechanical precision of men who understood violence as a language more honest than diplomacy. Marcus rode beside him, silent and watchful. The city gates stood open because closing them would have required acknowledging what everyone already knew. Duke Cassian Raventhorn had just brought an army into the heart of the kingdom, and the crown had roughly 3 minutes to decide whether this ended in negotiation or bloodshed. Royal guards lined the main avenue in ceremonial armor that looked impressive until someone remembered ceremonial meant decorative,
not functional. They watched the Blackthorn cavalry pass with expressions caught between duty and self-preservation instinct. Cassian kept his eyes forward, scanning rooftops for archers who might be stupid enough to start a war they couldn't finish. None appeared. Smart. The crown understood optics even if they misunderstood everything else about power dynamics. The procession halted outside the administrative palace, where ministers conducted business behind marble columns and political theater. Cassian dismounted with controlled movements that suggested coiled violence waiting for permission to deploy. A royal official emerged from the entrance, his face pale beneath powdered wig and bureaucratic authority. "Duke Raventhorn, you cannot simply ride armed forces into the capital without—"
"Where is she?" Cassian's voice cut through protocol like a blade through silk. The official stammered, "I don't understand what— Oh, Lady Seraphina Vale, protective custody. Where?" "That information is classified under Crown authority and cannot be disclosed to—" Cassian drew his sword. The sound of steel leaving scabbard echoed across the courtyard, while 200 cavalry simultaneously readied weapons with synchronized precision that turned atmosphere from tense to lethal in the gates. Space between heartbeats. The official took 3 steps backward. "The Eastern Tower," he said quickly. "3rd floor. But Duke Raventhorn, you must understand that attempting to remove a prisoner held under royal decree constitutes—" "I don't care." Cassian sheathed his sword and turned to Marcus. "Hold position. Anyone who interferes gets 1 warning. After that, your judgment." Marcus nodded once, understanding the unspoken permission beneath formal orders. Cassian walked toward the palace entrance alone, boots striking marble with steady rhythm that sounded like inevitability approaching. Guards stationed at doorways made no attempt to stop him. They recognized the expression of someone moving past the point where threats mattered, and self-preservation outweighed duty to institutions that paid poorly and forgot loyalty when convenient. The Eastern Tower stairs spiraled upward through stone architecture built to intimidate visitors with height and isolation. Cassian climbed without hesitation, counting floors, calculating exits, preparing for resistance that would require immediate and overwhelming response. 3rd floor landing. Single door reinforced with iron bars and royal seals that meant nothing except decoration at this point. 2 guards stood outside. "Step aside, Cassian said quietly. The older guard shifted his weight. "We have orders, and I have 200 cavalry in the courtyard who will execute those orders permanently if you force escalation. Step aside or commit to violence. Choose now." The guards exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations about duty versus survival, orders versus reality, noble intentions versus messy consequences. They stepped aside. Cassian opened the door. The room beyond was small, furnished with the minimal comfort required to maintain pretense that imprisonment was protective instead of punitive. Seraphina sat beside a narrow window overlooking courtyard stones 3 stories below, still wearing the evening gown from the gala where everything had started unraveling according to plan. She turned when the door opened. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Seraphina stood slowly, composure intact despite circumstances that should have shattered anyone less practiced at survival. "You came. Did you doubt it?" Cassian remained in the doorway, aware that guards outside could still hear everything. Doubt? No. But hoping someone will act and watching them actually follow through are different experiences. She moved toward him with careful steps that suggested exhaustion hidden beneath performance. "They've been interrogating me for hours. Very polite. Very insistent that I recant the evidence and claim coercion. And your response? I told them to investigate the documentation instead of threatening the person who provided it. They didn't appreciate the suggestion." Her eyes held his steadily. "What happens now?" "Now we leave. Together. You're coming north to Blackthorn Keep, where the Crown's protective custody transforms into irrelevant bureaucratic noise." Seraphina glanced toward the window. "They'll call it kidnapping. Let them. I've already committed treason by riding armed forces into the capital. Adding kidnapping to the list changes nothing except their rhetorical options." He extended his hand. "Unless you prefer staying here while ministers debate your fate in comfortable rooms 3 floors below." She took his hand without hesitation. The contact felt different than their agreement in the hunting lodge. This wasn't negotiation. It was trust forged under pressure.
Partnership tested by consequences that arrived faster and harder than either anticipated. They walked down the tower stairs together while guards pretended not to notice a duke extracting a prisoner from royal custody in broad daylight. Outside, cavalry waited in perfect formation, weapons ready, horses steady beneath riders who understood this moment balanced on the edge between political crisis and actual warfare. Cassian helped Seraphina mount behind him on the war horse that had carried him through too many battles to count. She wrapped arms around his waist with practical necessity instead of romantic gesture, holding on because falling meant death or recapture, both equally unacceptable. "We're leaving," Cassian announced to assembled forces. "Anyone who attempts interference gets one warning. After that, no mercy. That's it." The cavalry moved as a single entity, turning north toward city gates and territories beyond where crown authority faded into suggestion instead of law. Citizens watched from windows and doorways, witnessing history without understanding they were seeing the moment when centralized power discovered its limits. Royal guards made no attempt to stop them. Ministers watched from palace balconies with expressions that promised retaliation even as they accepted immediate defeat. And Duke Cassian Raventhorn rode out of the capital with Seraphina Vale secured behind him and 200 warriors at his back, daring the crown to follow through on threats everyone knew would require commitment they didn't possess. The journey north took 3 days through winter landscape that transformed from urban density to rural isolation with every mile. They stopped at loyal estates where Cassian's reputation preceded arrival, and hospitality was offered without questions because questions implied doubt. Seraphina rode in silence mostly, conserving energy and processing the rapid escalation from protected noblewoman to fugitive allied with the North's most dangerous duke. She slept when they stopped, ate when food appeared, and asked no questions about strategy or consequences. On the second night, while cavalry rested at a fortified inn owned by families who'd served Blackthorn interests for generations, Cassian found her standing outside beneath stars that looked closer in northern territories. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." She didn't turn around. "But neither of us is particularly skilled at rest when circumstances demand constant vigilance." Cassian joined her, maintaining respectful distance despite proximity feeling increasingly complicated. "Any regrets about partnership? About exposing corruption? No. About the speed at which everything collapsed? Maybe." She finally looked at him. "I expected retaliation. I didn't expect you to ride into the capital with an army. What did you expect?" Political maneuvering, diplomatic pressure. The usual aristocratic chess match where everyone pretends violence isn't the underlying threat keeping everything civilized. I'm not good at pretending," Cassian said flatly. "And I learned years ago that people respect direct action more than elegant strategy. The council took you because they assumed I'd negotiate. They were wrong." Seraphina studied his profile against starlight. "You started a war for me." "I started a war against institutions that deserve dismantling. You were the catalyst, not the cause. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I stand, it looks like you risked everything to extract one woman from a tower cell when strategic withdrawal would have preserved your position." Cassian turned to face her completely. Strategic withdrawal would have meant abandoning an ally when she needed support most. That's not governance. That's cowardice dressed as pragmatism. I don't rule that way. Wait, borrow some unso. How do you rule? With absolute clarity about priorities. The Northern Territories matter because people depend on leadership that doesn't compromise when threatened. You matter because partnership means protection regardless of cost. Everything else is noise designed to distract from simple truths. Seraphina was silent for a moment. Seraphina. The council will never forgive this. Good. Forgiveness implies they possessed moral authority worth respecting. They don't. He paused. Are you afraid? Of the council? No. Of what comes next? Yes. I've spent my entire life inside structures that defined safety as obedience. Now I'm allied with someone who defines safety as absolute control over immediate environment regardless of external approval. Does that bother you? It should, she admitted, but mostly I feel relieved, like I've been holding my breath for years and someone finally gave permission to exhale. Cassian understood that feeling better than language could articulate. The aristocracy suffocated people slowly through expectations, obligations, and performances required to maintain standing inside hierarchies built on exploitation. Breaking free felt dangerous and necessary simultaneously. When we reach Blackthorn Keep, he said carefully, you'll be safe from the crown but not from judgment. Nobles will call you my mistress. Ministers will claim you're a political tool. And every enemy I've accumulated will use your presence as evidence of weakness or corruption or whatever narrative serves their agenda best. And your response to those accusations? Gibberish disjamot. I'll ignore them until ignoring becomes strategically disadvantageous. Then I'll destroy whoever pushes hardest and watch the others recalibrate their assumptions. His expression didn't change. But you need to understand what sanctuary at Blackthorn actually means. It's not a comfortable exile. It's alignment with everything the aristocracy despises about northern governance. Which is what exactly? Honesty about power. I don't pretend to rule through consent or democratic principles. I rule because I'm willing to make decisions others avoid and accept consequences they fear. That makes me effective and terrifying in equal measure. Aligning with me means accepting that terror serves a purpose. Serafina nodded slowly. I understand. And I'm choosing it anyway because the alternative is returning to cages decorated with prettier lies. Ars wo amamul. They stood together beneath northern stars while cavalry slept and horses rested and the future compressed into something immediate and unavoidable. Tomorrow, they would reach Blackthorn Keep. The day after, the crown would send formal demands for Serafina's return. And somewhere inside the gap between demand and response, war would crystallize from threat into reality. But tonight, two people who'd chosen partnership over survival stood in cold air and acknowledged the truth beneath every alliance. Some things were worth destroying everything to protect. And once you accepted that premise, strategy became simpler, even as consequences grew more catastrophic. The third day brought them within sight of Blackthorn Keep as sunset painted iron gates gold against winter stone. Serafina saw the fortress for the first time and understood immediately why the North remained unconquerable despite centuries of southern ambition. This wasn't a palace. It was a declaration carved from landscape and reinforced with the kind of brutal practicality that prioritized defense over decoration. Soldiers lined the battlements in perfect formation. Banners bearing the Raventhorn crest moved in wind that carried the smell of snow and smoke from heating fires burning inside courtyards built to withstand siege conditions. Marcus waited at the gates with household staff arranged to receive their duke and the woman whose presence would transform political crisis into existential conflict. Welcome home, Marcus said as Cassian dismounted. Prepare the East Wing guest quarters, Cassian ordered. Lady Vale requires accommodation befitting her station and security that ensures no one reaches her without going through multiple layers of armed resistance first. Marcus nodded, already moving to execute instructions while servants guided Serafina toward the interior chambers, where warmth and safety waited after days of travel through hostile territory. Cassian watched her disappear into the fortress before turning to his cavalry commander. Double perimeter guard. I want scouts positioned on every approach road. The Crown will send representatives within the week, and I need advance warning before they arrive, thinking surprise grants advantage. The commander saluted and began issuing orders that would transform Blackthorn from residence into military installation. Inside, Cassian found Marcus waiting in his private study, where maps and correspondence covered every surface. The council sent 3 separate demands while you were south, Marcus said without preamble, all insisting you return Lady Vale immediately or face charges of treason, kidnapping, and inciting rebellion against Crown authority. My response? I told them you'd address their concerns upon return. That was 2 days ago. They're expecting immediate compliance. Cassian poured wine and drank slowly, considering options that narrowed with every passing hour. Send a formal reply stating that Lady Serafina Vale is a guest at Blackthorn Keep under my personal protection. Explain that she provided evidence of council corruption and deserves sanctuary instead of imprisonment. Invite them to investigate the documentation she supplied rather than threatening the person who exposed their crimes. That's a declaration of defiance. It's a statement of fact presented politely enough to maintain diplomatic pretense. What they do with it determines whether this escalates into open warfare or transforms into a political stalemate. Neither side can win cleanly. Marcus set down the glass he'd been holding. Cassian, you know they can't let this stand. The crown's authority depends on nobles accepting consequences when they challenge centralized power. If you successfully defy Parliament over a woman they legally detained, then other nobles might remember they have agency beyond obedience, Cassian finished. Yes, that's exactly what terrifies them. Not my defiance specifically, but the example it sets. If Duke Raventhorn can reject crown authority and survive, what prevents others from doing the same? Nothing. Which is why they'll come at you with everything available. Military force, economic sanctions, alliances designed to isolate the northern territories until you're forced into submission. Cassian walked to the window overlooking courtyard stones where soldiers moved through evening routines with practiced efficiency. Let them try. The North survived worse than political pressure. We've got supply lines, loyal forces, and defensive positions that would turn any invasion into a prolonged nightmare. The Crown wants quick resolution. They won't get it. And Serafina? What's her role in all this beyond the catalyst that started the conflict? Good question. Cassian had been asking himself the same thing during 3 days of travel, where partnership felt increasingly complicated by factors that had nothing to do with political strategy. She stays here under protection until the council realizes destroying her accomplishes nothing except proving they prioritize revenge over justice. After that, he paused. After that, she decides whether remaining at Blackthorn serves her interests or becomes another cage with better security. Marcus heard the unspoken complexity beneath words. You care about her. I respect her courage and her intelligence. Whether that constitutes caring depends on how you define the term. Cassian, I know what you're going to say. Emotional attachment creates vulnerability. Strategic decisions become compromised when personal feelings enter calculations. All true, all irrelevant. He turned from the window. I extracted her from royal custody because leaving her there would have made partnership meaningless. Everything else is consequence management. Marcus studied his duke with the frankness only years of friendship permitted. You're lying to yourself. But I suppose that's necessary sometimes when truth becomes tactically disadvantageous. Before Cassian could respond, a knock interrupted the conversation. A servant entered with message sealed in royal crimson wax. Marcus broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening with each line. The Crown is sending Prince Lucian Valamont north with a diplomatic delegation. They arrive in 4 days with a formal proposal regarding Serafina's status and your continued governance of the northern territories. Cassian felt something cold settle in his chest. Prince Lucien was the man Serafina had been engaged to before Cassian destroyed the arrangement through public defiance. Sending him now wasn't diplomacy. It was psychological warfare designed to force emotional reactions that undermined strategic positioning. What's the proposal? Right? What? But not specified. But reading between political language, they're offering a deal. Return Serafina to royal custody for trial regarding the corruption allegations, accept formal censure for the armed incursion into the capital, and they'll consider the matter resolved without pursuing treason charges. And if I refuse, then Prince Lucien has authorization to negotiate your removal from ducal authority through Regency Council vote. They've lined up enough support to make it legal under parliamentary procedure. Cassian absorbed the threat without visible reaction. The Crown had learned from previous mistakes. Instead of crude intimidation, they were using legal mechanisms and emotional manipulation simultaneously. Refuse the deal, lose everything. Accept the deal, abandon Serafina, and validate Crown authority over northern governance. Both options were unacceptable. When Lucien arrives, Cassian said slowly, he'll discover that negotiation requires leverage, and he has none. Serafina stays under my protection. My authority over the northern territories remains absolute, and if Parliament wants to debate Regency councils, they can do it from the capital while we continue governing effectively up here. They'll call it rebellion. Let them. Labels don't change reality.
I control resources, territory, and loyalty that Parliament needs more than I need their approval. Force them to acknowledge that truth, or watch them waste energy on symbolic victories that accomplish nothing. Marcus folded the message carefully. This is the point of no return, Cassian. Once you formally refuse crown authority in front of a royal delegation, there's no walking it back. You'll be marked as a rebel regardless of legal justification. Good. Cassian's voice carried absolute certainty. I'm tired of pretending institutions built on corruption deserve deference. The aristocracy has been rotting from within for decades, while everyone performed loyalty to maintain status. Someone needs to force the confrontation they've been avoiding. Might as well be me. The next 4 days transformed Blackthorn Keep into a fortress prepared for diplomatic theater that could collapse into violence with minimal provocation. Soldiers reinforced defensive positions. Servants prepared guest quarters with meticulous attention to protocol that maintained respect while communicating strength. Marcus coordinated intelligence networks that would report any unusual military movements near northern borders. And Serafina adapted to life inside a fortress where her presence had become the focal point of conflict that threatened the entire kingdom's stability. Cassian found her in the library on the second day, surrounded by books she'd pulled from shelves with apparent randomness. "Finding everything you need?" he asked. She looked up from a leather-bound volume on Northern history. "More than I expected. Your library contains texts I've only heard referenced in academic circles." My father believed education was the only inheritance that couldn't be stolen or destroyed. He collected rare manuscripts obsessively. Cassian moved into the room. Cassian, though I suspect you're not reading for pleasure. No, I'm trying to understand the legal precedents that might support your position when the Crown challenges your authority. There's surprisingly robust documentation regarding territorial autonomy in northern governance structures. Cassian almost smiled. Even facing crisis, she approached problems through research and analysis. Legal precedent matters less than power dynamics. The Crown will cite whatever laws serve their argument. We'll cite different laws. Eventually, someone decides which interpretation becomes reality through force of will, or force of arms. Serafina set down the book. Prince Lucien arrives tomorrow. Are you prepared for that confrontation? Are you? He was your fiancé before I destroyed the engagement through public declaration. He was never my fiancé. He was a political arrangement my father negotiated without consulting my preferences. Lucien is charming, educated, and completely uninterested in anything except maintaining his position in succession hierarchy. We would have made each other miserable while performing happiness for court audiences. And now he's coming here to negotiate your return. No, Serafina corrected. He's coming here to perform concern while actually negotiating your submission. I'm the excuse, not the objective. The Crown wants you broken or removed. Using me as leverage just provides emotional weight to bureaucratic pressure. Cassian studied her carefully. Does seeing him again bother you? Should it? He never mattered beyond what his title represented. Now even that representation is irrelevant because I'm no longer playing the game where princes are prizes worth competing for. She stood, moving toward the window overlooking snow-covered battlements. What bothers me is knowing my presence here creates vulnerability. The Council will use every interaction, every moment we spend in proximity, as evidence of impropriety that undermines your authority. Let them. I didn't bring you to Blackthorn to hide you in distant chambers and pretend our alliance is purely strategic. Partnership means standing together regardless of what enemies say about it. Serafina turned to face him. You're willing to let them call me your mistress? Your political weakness? The woman who corrupted the incorruptible Duke of Blackthorn Keep? I'm willing to ignore noise while focusing on substance. What they call you matters less than what you actually are. An ally who exposed corruption at significant personal cost and deserves protection instead of judgment. Cassian, whatever you're about to say, stop. I know the risks. I know the consequences. I extracted you from royal custody with full awareness that it would trigger exactly this escalation. None of that changes the fact that leaving you there would have been wrong.
He moved closer. The council believes I'm compromised by emotion. They're partially right, but emotion doesn't make decisions weak when it aligns with principle. It makes them absolute. Mas. For a moment, Serafina looked like she wanted to argue. Then something in her expression shifted to acceptance. Tomorrow, when Lucien arrives, he'll try to divide us through manipulation. He's skilled at finding pressure points and exploiting them through seemingly reasonable suggestions. Then we present a united position and refuse to engage with tactics designed to create doubt. He'll leave with nothing except confirmation that Blackthorn Keep doesn't compromise under pressure. The next morning arrived with winter sun cutting through frost-covered windows. Cassian dressed in formal attire that communicated authority without ostentation. Black coat, silver buttons bearing the Raventhorn crest, no unnecessary decoration. He looked like exactly what he was, a ruler who didn't require symbols to project power. The royal delegation arrived at noon with Prince Lucien Valemont riding at the front of a procession designed to impress through pageantry. Banners, uniformed guards, carriages built for comfort instead of function. Everything calculated to remind the North that the crown possessed resources beyond military force. Cassian received them in the great hall with Marcus standing beside him and Serafina seated in a chair positioned to communicate her status as guest, under protection instead of prisoner, or possession. Prince Lucien entered with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. He was handsome in the classical sense, blonde hair, perfectly styled, blue eyes sharp with intelligence that often passed for wisdom in aristocratic circles. His gaze found Serafina immediately. "Lady Vale, I'm relieved to see you safe after such harrowing circumstances." Serafina's expression remained neutral. "Thank you, Your Highness. Though I should clarify that I was never in danger here, Duke Raventhorn has been exceptionally hospitable." Lucien smiled with practiced charm. "I'm certain he has, though the Crown remains concerned about the circumstances of your departure from protective custody." "You mean my extraction from imprisonment under false pretenses?" Cassian said flatly. "Let's dispense with diplomatic euphemisms. You're here because I took something the Crown claimed ownership over, and that challenges their authority regardless of legal justification." Lucien's smile didn't fade, but his eyes sharpened. "Direct as always, Duke Raventhorn. Very well. The Crown acknowledges your grievances regarding council corruption. Investigations are underway based on the evidence Lady Vale provided. However, removing her from royal custody through armed force created a crisis that supersedes the original allegations. Only because the Crown chose to imprison someone who exposed corruption instead of investigating the actual criminals. Nevertheless, Lucien continued, we find ourselves in an unfortunate position. The Crown cannot allow nobles to defy parliamentary authority without consequences. Doing so would undermine the entire governance structure. "The governance structure," Cassian said coldly, "is already undermined by ministers who treat positions as opportunities for personal enrichment. Maybe focus on fixing that before lecturing me about proper procedure." Lucien's composure cracked slightly. "Your contempt for proper channels is precisely why the Council questions your fitness for continued leadership. A duke who ignores Crown authority when convenient cannot be trusted to maintain stability." "I ignore Crown authority when it serves corruption instead of justice. There's a difference." "Not to Parliament." Lucien moved further into the room. "Which brings me to the proposal. Return Lady Vale to royal custody for formal trial regarding the allegations. Accept censure for the armed incursion. In exchange, the Crown will consider your position secure, pending review of Northern governance practices." Cassian laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You're offering me the privilege of surrendering everything in exchange for maybe keeping my position if I perform sufficient contrition. That's not a proposal. That's surrender with bureaucratic decoration. It's compromise designed to prevent civil war." "No, it's capitulation disguised as diplomacy, and I'm refusing." Cassian's voice dropped to something colder. "Serafina stays here under my protection. My authority over the Northern Territories remains absolute. And if Parliament wants to debate regency councils, they can waste time on symbolic votes while we continue governing effectively." Lucien's expression hardened. "Duke Raventhorn, you're making a catastrophic mistake. The The crown has resources, alliances, legal authority that will crush you eventually. Defiance only delays the inevitable. Then let's test that theory. Send armies, impose sanctions, turn the entire aristocracy against me. We'll see whether the North breaks first or the crown runs out of resources maintaining pressure against a territory that controls essential supply lines. For the first time, genuine anger showed in Lucian's eyes. This is about the woman. You're risking everything because you've developed an inappropriate attachment that clouds your judgment. Before Cassian could respond, Seraphina stood. Your Highness, she said quietly, you're mistaking partnership for weakness. Duke Raventhorn isn't compromised by emotion. He's operating from a position of principle that the aristocracy abandoned generations ago. The fact that you can't distinguish between the two explains why the crown is failing. Lucian stared at her. Seraphina, they're using you. Can't you see that? This alliance serves Raventhorn's agenda while putting you at risk of charges ranging from treason to sedition. I provided the evidence that exposed council corruption. I chose alliance with someone willing to protect me instead of surrendering to institutions that view women as currency. Those were my decisions, not manipulations. She moved to stand beside Cassian. And I'm choosing to remain at Blackthorn Keep because sanctuary here is genuine, unlike the protective custody that was actually imprisonment. Lucian's jaw tightened. You're both making a mistake that will destroy everything you're trying to protect. Maybe, Cassian said, or maybe we're forcing a confrontation the aristocracy needs regardless of personal cost. Either way, the answer is no. Take that message back to the crown and tell them if they want Seraphina, they'll have to come through Blackthorn forces to get her. I promise that experience will be educational. The prince looked between them, recognition dawning that this wasn't negotiation. It was declaration. Two people had chosen alliance over survival and were daring the crown to make their defiance matter more than principle. Then we're done here, Lucian said coldly. I'll inform the crown that Duke Cassian Raventhorn has formally rejected crown authority and chosen rebellion. What happens next is on your heads. Good, Cassian replied. At least we're clear about positions. Now get out of my fortress before I decide diplomatic immunity is another comfortable fiction that deserves testing. Lucian left with his delegation, banners and carriages retreating south, while winter wind erased evidence of their presence within minutes. In the great hall, silence settled like ash after fire. Marcus approached carefully. You just declared war against the crown. No, Cassian corrected. I refuse surrender. They declared war the moment they imprisoned Seraphina for exposing corruption. Everything after that is consequence management. Seraphina remained standing beside him, processing the reality that partnership had just transformed into something impossible to reverse. What happens now? Now we prepare for siege conditions and watch the crown discover that some territories won't break regardless of pressure. Cassian looked at her directly. You can still leave, Cassian looked at. Take sanctuary elsewhere, claim coercion, negotiate independent peace. I won't stop you. No, she said simply. I chose this alliance knowing the risks. Walking away now would validate everything the aristocracy believes about women as political tools instead of autonomous people. I stay. Cassian felt something shift in his chest. Not love, though that existed beneath everything else. This was recognition that partnership had evolved into something deeper than strategic necessity. They were bound now by choices that couldn't be unmade and consequences that would define both their lives regardless of outcome. Then we stand together, he said quietly, and force the crown to decide whether crushing one northern duchy is worth the cost of revealing exactly how fragile their authority actually is. Outside, snow began falling across Blackthorn territories, while soldiers reinforced defensive positions and servants prepared for the kind of prolonged conflict that would test every resource, every loyalty, every assumption about power. And inside the fortress, Duke Cassian Raventhorn stood beside Lady Seraphina Vale, two people who had crossed the point of no return and refused to look back because some things were worth destroying the world to protect. The crown would come. Parliament would send armies and economic sanctions and legal arguments designed to justify violence against rebellion. But Blackthorn Keep had survived worse than political pressure. And this time, the man defending it had something the aristocracy never understood: absolute certainty that compromise was weakness and defiance was survival, and some battles were worth fighting regardless of whether winning was possible, because the alternative was becoming the kind of person who deserved destruction. Winter deepened across Blackthorn territories with the kind of cold that killed quietly, transforming landscape into something hostile and unforgiving. Cassian spent the first week after Lucian's departure preparing for siege conditions that seemed inevitable now that diplomatic options had collapsed into open defiance. Supply lines were reinforced, grain stores inventoried and rationed for extended conflict. Soldiers drilled in courtyard snow until movements became automatic, muscle memory replacing conscious thought during moments when thinking slowed reaction time enough to mean death. Marcus coordinated everything with mechanical precision, transforming the fortress into a self-sufficient military installation capable of withstanding months of isolation. If the Crown decided economic strangulation served their purposes better than direct assault. And Serafina adapted to life inside walls built to repel invasion, learning the rhythms of a place where survival demanded constant vigilance instead of social performance. Cassian found her in the armory on the 8th day, examining weapons with the clinical focus of someone studying tools instead of instruments of violence. "Planning to join the cavalry?" he asked. She looked up from a crossbow she'd been inspecting, planning to understand what protection actually requires beyond locked doors and armed guards. If the Crown sends forces north, everyone inside these walls becomes a target. I'd rather know how to defend myself than depend entirely on others. Cassian moved into the armory, boots echoing against stone floors. "Marcus can arrange training if you're serious. I'm serious about everything I commit to. You should know that by now." He did. Serafina approached partnership with the same absolute certainty that defined her decision to expose council corruption despite knowing consequences would be catastrophic. She didn't hedge. She committed completely or not at all. "The Crown hasn't moved yet," Cassian said, changing subjects. "Intelligence reports suggest they're consolidating support among southern nobles before taking action, building coalition legitimacy for whatever they're planning, which means they're preparing something significant enough to require political cover." Serafina set down the crossbow. "Mass mobilization, economic sanctions, both probably, maybe worse. The longer they wait, the more comprehensive their strategy becomes. They want overwhelming force that breaks us quickly, instead of prolonged conflict that drains resources on both sides." Can Blackthorn withstand overwhelming force? Cassian considered the question with brutal honesty. "Depends on definition. Militarily? Yes. We control defensive terrain and have supply advantages that turn invasion into nightmare logistics. Politically? That's more complicated. If enough northern nobles decide siding with the Crown serves their interests better than loyalty to Blackthorn, we become isolated instead of defended by regional alliance. And how many northern nobles would betray you?" Unknown. Loyalty is expensive, and fear only maintains discipline until someone offers better terms. He paused. "That's why I've been careful about alliances. Better to control smaller territory absolutely than command larger regions through conditional support that evaporates under pressure." Serafina studied him with the intensity that suggested she was analyzing more than tactical discussion. "You trust almost no one." "I trust competence and aligned incentives. Everything else is performance that collapses when tested." "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the armory air like smoke. Cassian met her gaze directly. "I trust that your survival depends on this alliance succeeding. That's more reliable than loyalty based on affection or moral principle. Shared necessity creates stronger bonds than sentiment." Something flickered across Serafina's expression. Disappointment maybe, or recognition that partnership built on pragmatism carried limitations sentiment might have transcended. "That's a depressing philosophy," she said quietly. "It's an accurate one. I've watched men swear eternal loyalty and then betray those oaths the moment circumstances shifted. Sentiment is beautiful until it becomes tactically disadvantageous. Then it disappears faster than morning frost. And if circumstances shifted here? If siding with the Crown became strategically superior to maintaining our alliance?" Cassian moved closer, closing distance until they stood near enough that breath became visible in cold air between them. then I'd expect you to make whatever decision serves your survival. I wouldn't blame you for it. I'd simply adjust strategy to account for changed variables.
You really believe that? Yes. Then you're lying to yourself about something fundamental. Serafina's voice stayed level despite the accusation. Because extracting me from royal custody wasn't strategic calculation. It was commitment that superseded tactical advantage. You risked everything for partnership that could have been abandoned with minimal cost. I risked everything to prove alliance means protection regardless of convenience. That's different than sentiment. Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're terrified of admitting you care about something beyond power and survival. Like caring makes you weak. Cassian's jaw tightened. Caring does make you weak when enemies use it as leverage. I've seen it destroy better men than me. Your father. The words landed like a physical blow. Cassian stepped back, expression closing into the mask he wore when conversations approached territory too dangerous to navigate honestly. My father is irrelevant to current circumstances. No, he's not. He's the reason you trust no one. The reason you believe sentiment is weakness instead of strength. Someone he trusted destroyed him. And you've been building walls ever since to ensure the same thing never happens to you. Serafina, I'm right and you know it. That's why this conversation makes you uncomfortable. You've convinced yourself that isolation equals safety, but isolation is just another cage with better rationalization. Before Cassian could respond, Marcus entered the armory with expression that suggested urgent news requiring immediate attention. We have a problem, Marcus said without preamble. Lord Garrett Ashford just arrived at the gates requesting immediate audience. He claims to bring intelligence regarding Crown military movements. Cassian's mind raced through implications. Garrett Ashford was a minor northern noble with estates bordering Blackthorn territory. Not particularly powerful or influential, but strategically positioned to observe southern military activity. Bring him to the war room, and Marcus, make sure he searched for weapons before the meeting. Marcus nodded and departed while Cassian turned back to Serafina. This conversation isn't finished, she said. No, but it's postponed. He moved toward the door. Stay in the east wing until I determine whether Ashford's visit represents opportunity or threat. Cassian, please. The word came out rougher than intended. Just this once, trust that my paranoia serves a purpose. Serafina's expression softened slightly. I'll wait. But we're continuing this discussion whether you like it or not. Cassian left without responding, moving through fortress corridors toward the war room where maps covered tables and strategic plans lay stacked in organized chaos, representing weeks of preparation. Lord Garrett Ashford waited inside, flanked by two guards who'd clearly searched him thoroughly. He was younger than Cassian expected, maybe 30, with the nervous energy of someone carrying information too dangerous to hold comfortably. Duke Raventhorn, thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Cassian sat behind the war table without offering pleasantries. What intelligence justifies riding to Blackthorn unannounced during conditions that make travel actively dangerous? Ashford glanced at the guards, then at Marcus, who stood near the door with hand resting casually on sword hilt. Perhaps we could speak privately. No, Cassian said flatly. Marcus stays. The guards stay. If your information is genuine, privacy is unnecessary. If it's fabricated, witnesses prevent later disputes about what was actually said. Now talk. Ashford swallowed hard. The Crown is mobilizing 3 armies, Northern Approach, Eastern Pass, Western Mountain Route, coordinated assault designed to surround Blackthorn and force surrender through overwhelming numbers. Cassian absorbed the information without visible reaction. Triple approach meant significant resource commitment and coordination that required weeks of planning, which meant the Crown had been preparing this response since before Lucien's diplomatic mission failed. Timeline? 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if weather slows mobilization. But they're coming, Duke Raventhorn, and they're bringing enough force to level this fortress if you refuse surrender. Marcus moved forward slightly. How did you acquire this intelligence? What? My cousin serves in the Royal Quartermaster Corps. He sent word through family channels warning me to evacuate estates near predicted conflict zones. I came here immediately because... Ashford paused. Because the Northern Territories deserve warning before slaughter arrives. Noble sentiment, suspicious in its timing and presentation. Cassian had learned long ago that information offered freely usually carried hidden costs. And what do you expect in exchange for this warning? Ashford met his gaze directly. Sanctuary. When the Crown discovers I warned you, my estates will be seized and my family arrested for treason. I need protection for myself and my household. 20 people total. I'm asking for shelter inside Blackthorn until the conflict resolves. Ars, this. There it was. The transaction beneath generosity, information for safety, wrapped in noble language about territorial loyalty. Cassian considered options with brutal calculus. Accepting Ashford meant additional mouths to feed during siege conditions. It also meant potential intelligence source regarding Crown strategy. Refusing meant losing valuable warning and potentially creating enemy where ally might serve better. You can stay, Cassian said finally. East Tower, 4th floor. Your household will be searched thoroughly before entering the fortress. Any weapons are confiscated. Any suspicious behavior results in immediate expulsion regardless of external conditions. Understood? Relief flooded Ashford's face. Thank you, Your Grace. I swear you won't regret this decision. I regret most decisions eventually. The question is whether regret matters more than utility. Cassian stood. Marcus will arrange quarters and security protocols. Don't interpret hospitality as trust. Your guests under surveillance until I determine your information is accurate and your loyalty is genuine. Ashford departed with guards escorting him toward assigned quarters, while Marcus remained in the war room, studying maps with the focus that preceded difficult tactical conversations. You don't believe him, Marcus said. I believe he brought information that aligns with Crown strategy. Whether he's genuine refugee or planted intelligence asset remains unclear. But Cassian traced potential approach routes on the map. Triple assault is aggressive but logical. The Crown wants quick resolution, and they're willing to commit resources that ensure overwhelming advantage. Can we hold against 3 armies? Depends on coordination and supply lines. If they attack simultaneously, we're divided across multiple defensive positions. If they attack sequentially, we concentrate forces and bleed them individually. He paused. The real question is whether northern nobles support us or fragment under pressure. Ashford's arrival might indicate broader collapse of regional loyalty. Marcus was quiet for a moment. We should send scouts to verify his intelligence. Already planning it. I want confirmation before committing to defensive posture that might be based on fabricated threats. Cassian looked at his oldest friend. Something about this feels wrong. The timing, the presentation, the convenient family connection that provides justification for possessing classified military information. You think he's Crown agent? I think he's either legitimate refugee or extremely well-prepared infiltrator. Either way, we treat him as potential threat until proven otherwise. The next 48 hours crawled past while scouts rode south, gathering intelligence, and Ashford's household settled into quarters that were comfortable but clearly designed to prevent unsupervised movement through the fortress. Guards rotated watches. Servants reported on conversations overheard during meals. Every interaction was monitored because paranoia kept people alive when trust became liability. On the 3rd night, scouts returned with confirmation that made Cassian's blood turn cold. Royal armies were indeed mobilizing. 3 separate forces, exactly as Ashford described. Northern approach, Eastern Pass, Western mountain route. Coordination suggested months of planning and resource commitment that meant the Crown viewed this conflict as existential rather than merely political, which meant Ashford's intelligence was genuine, or the Crown had fed him accurate information deliberately to establish credibility before deploying whatever actual strategy they'd prepared. Cassian stood in the war room at midnight, staring at maps that suddenly felt inadequate for the scale of approaching catastrophe. 3 armies meant 30,000 soldiers minimum. Blackthorn could field maybe 5,000 defenders, including militia and conscripted civilians. The mathematics were brutal. Marcus entered quietly, carrying reports from perimeter scouts. All confirmed, he said without preamble. Ashford's intelligence is accurate down to specific regiment movements and supply train positioning. Either he's legitimate, or the Crown is running the most elaborate deception I've ever seen. Cassian didn't respond immediately. Something nagged at his instincts, some pattern his conscious mind hadn't yet identified, but his survival sense recognized as danger. Where is Ashford now? East Tower with his household. Guards report normal behavior, no suspicious activities. And Serafina? East Wing, likely asleep. She requested access to the library earlier, but returned to quarters an hour ago. Cassian nodded slowly, mind racing through scenarios and counter-scenarios. The Crown wanted him destroyed, that much was obvious. But the method felt wrong. Triple military assault was expensive, politically complicated, and risked galvanizing northern opposition into unified resistance. Unless the military mobilization was distraction, unless the real attack came from inside the fortress, while attention focused on external threats. The realization hit like cold water. "Wake Serafina," Cassian ordered. "Bring her to my private quarters immediately. Full armed escort." Marcus's eyes widened with understanding. I think we're looking at the wrong threat. Move, now." Marcus ran. Cassian grabbed weapons from the wall rack, checking loads and edges with automatic precision born from decades of survival. If he was wrong, he'd look paranoid and waste everyone's time. If he was right, the next few minutes would determine whether Blackthorn Keep stood or fell from within. He moved through corridors toward the east wing, where Serafina's quarters occupied a secured section designed to be defensible. Guards should be stationed outside. Protocols required constant surveillance. The corridor was empty. No guards, no servants, nothing except silence that screamed warning to anyone trained to recognize absence as evidence. Cassian drew his sword and approached Serafina's door with controlled movements that minimized sound. He pressed his ear against wood, listening for voices or movement inside. Nothing. He tested the handle. Unlocked. Wrong. Everything was wrong. Cassian kicked the door open and entered low, blade ready for immediate threat. The room was destroyed. Furniture overturned, curtains torn, clear evidence of struggle ending in forced removal. Blood spattered across the floor near the window where someone had fought back hard enough to wound their attackers before being overwhelmed. And standing near the window with expression that combined triumph and regret, stood Lord Garrett Ashford, flanked by 4 armed men wearing Blackthorn Guard uniforms. "I'm sorry, Duke Raventhorn," Ashford said quietly, "but the Crown pays better than Northern loyalty, and my family's survival required choosing the winning side." Cassian felt something snap inside his chest. Not panic, not fear. This was the cold clarity that arrived when betrayal confirmed every paranoid instinct and proved that trust was exactly the weakness he'd always believed it to be. Where is she? Already gone. Delivered to Crown agents waiting outside your precious perimeter. You were so focused on military threats that you never considered the fortress might be compromised from within. Ashford smiled without humor. The guards you trusted? Half are Crown loyalists who've been waiting for the signal to act. The intelligence I provided? Accurate, but designed to position forces for maximum advantage once internal security collapsed. The 4 men in Blackthorn uniforms moved to surround Cassian, weapons drawn but not yet committed to violence. They knew his reputation. Smart. "You understand what you've done?" Cassian's voice stayed level despite fury building beneath the surface. "The Crown won't honor whatever promises they made. You're useful now, expendable later." "Maybe, but expendable later is better than dead immediately." Ashford gestured toward the door. "Drop your weapon, Duke Raventhorn. Your fortress is compromised, your forces are divided, and the woman you risked everything to protect is already being transported south for public trial. It's over." Cassian looked at the 4 guards, calculating angles and probabilities. He could kill maybe 2 before the others brought him down. 3 if luck favored speed over coordination. All 4 was possible, but unlikely. But fighting here accomplished nothing except satisfying pride. He needed to reach Marcus, needed to determine the full extent of infiltration, needed to find Serafina before Crown agents moved her beyond recovery distance. Cassian dropped his sword. The blade clattered against stone floor with finality that sounded like surrender. Ashford relaxed slightly, mistake recognized too late. Cassian moved, not toward Ashford or the guards, but toward the window and a diving roll that carried him through glass and frame before anyone could react. He fell 3 stories into courtyard snow.
landing hard enough to crack ribs but not break bones. Pain exploded through his chest, but adrenaline overrode damage signals. He ran. Behind him, shouts erupted as guards realized their prisoner had just escaped through the most suicidal exit available. Crossbow bolts hissed past his head, burying themselves in snow and stone with impacts that suggested poor aim or insufficient light. Cassian reached the armory and barricaded the door, buying seconds to arm himself properly. Sword, daggers, crossbow, anything portable and lethal. His mind raced through fortress layout, identifying which sections might still be loyal versus compromised. Marcus. He needed to find Marcus and determine whether his oldest friend was genuine ally or the deepest planted betrayal of all. The thought alone nearly broke something fundamental. But Cassian shoved emotion aside and focused on survival. Trust was luxury. Right now, he needed information and force of arms to retake his own fortress from enemies who'd infiltrated through his confidence in protocols that were supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. He moved through service corridors used by servants, spaces too narrow for armored pursuit. Behind him, alarm bells rang across Blackthorn Keep, alert systems activating too late to prevent the damage already done. Cassian emerged in his main courtyard and saw chaos. Loyalist soldiers fighting against men in Blackthorn uniforms who'd revealed themselves as Crown agents. Blood on snow, bodies falling. The fortress tearing itself apart from within, while external threats waited to exploit the collapse. This was the Crown's strategy. Not overwhelming military force, though that waited as backup. This was surgical infiltration designed to collapse Blackthorn from inside before armies ever engaged. Brilliant in its ruthlessness, devastating in its execution. And Cassian had walked directly into the trap because he'd trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. Across the courtyard, he spotted Marcus fighting 3 opponents simultaneously, blade work efficient and brutal. Still loyal then. Still fighting for Blackthorn despite the fortress collapsing around them. Cassian ran to join him, cutting down a Crown agent who'd been moving to flank Marcus from behind. The man died without understanding what killed him. Blade entering between ribs with precision earned through decades of combat. Marcus spun, nearly attacking before recognition stopped the blade inches from Cassian's throat. "The East Wing," Cassian said. "Seraphina?" "Gone." Ashford was Crown agent. Half our guard force turned the moment he gave the signal. They took her through the servant passages to avoid patrols. Marcus's expression was devastated. "I'm sorry." Expression. "I should have suspected." Later. "Right now, we retake the fortress or die trying. Where are our loyal forces?" "Scattered. Maybe 200 confirmed loyalists versus 400 infiltrators. The mathematics are bad." Cassian looked around at burning buildings and fighting soldiers, and the fortress he'd spent years building into something defensible now turned against itself. He'd been so focused on external threats that internal security had seemed manageable. He'd believed protocols prevented this level of infiltration. He'd trusted that fear and reputation maintained loyalty even when gold and promises offered alternatives. Every assumption had been catastrophically wrong. And Seraphina was gone, taken by the same Crown forces he'd defied to protect her in the first place. The partnership he'd built everything around had just become leverage for his destruction. This was what happened when monsters allowed themselves to care about something beyond power. Enemies identified the attachment and exploited it with surgical precision. Sentiment became weakness. Protection became vulnerability. Everything Cassian had warned himself about for years had just manifested exactly as predicted. A crossbow bolt took Marcus in the shoulder, spinning him backward into snow. Cassian killed the shooter and dropped beside his friend, examining the wound with hands that moved automatically despite mind screaming that they were losing, had already lost. We're watching the kingdom burn because one man had believed partnership was possible without vulnerability. "Go!" Marcus gasped. "Get her back. I'll hold here." "You can't hold against these numbers. Equal. Then I'll die buying you time to extract Seraphina before they move her south." Marcus gripped Cassian's arm with bloody fingers. "You risked everything for her once. Do it again. Prove that caring makes you stronger instead of weak." Cassian looked at his oldest friend bleeding in snow while their fortress burned and enemies closed in from all sides. This was the moment. The choice that would define everything that followed. He could stay and fight for Blackthorn Keep, trying to salvage what remained of his power base while Serafina was transported to the capital for show trial designed to break her publicly before execution. Or he could abandon the fortress entirely, chase after the woman whose partnership had just cost him everything, and prove that sentiment was worth more than strategic advantage. Every rational calculation said staying made sense. The fortress could be retaken, forces could be rallied, power could be rebuilt. But Serafina would be gone, and some part of Cassian that he'd buried beneath years of brutal pragmatism recognized that losing her mattered more than losing territory, position, or the reputation he'd built through fear and competence. "Hold as long as you can," Cassian said. "When you can't hold anymore, surrender. I'll negotiate your release after I get her back." Marcus almost smiled. "After you start another war to extract one woman from crown custody again. You're predictable, Cassian. Apparently not predictable enough. I walked into this trap like a novice." "No. You walked into it like someone who'd started caring about something beyond survival. That's not weakness. That's humanity finding its way back after years of suppression." Marcus's grip tightened. "Now go, before sentiment becomes suicide." Cassian ran. Behind him, Blackthorn Keep burned while loyalists fought desperately against overwhelming numbers. He grabbed a horse from the stables and rode through gates that stood open because security had collapsed from within. Snow fell across northern landscape that had been his domain for decades, and was now enemy territory controlled by forces that had outplayed him through strategy he should have anticipated. He'd been arrogant, believed his reputation made him untouchable, trusted that fear maintained loyalty better than gold or promises. Every assumption that had kept him alive and powerful for years had just proven catastrophically insufficient. And now he rode south alone, chasing after a woman held by crown agents who'd successfully destroyed his fortress through infiltration while he'd been too focused on external military threats to notice internal rot. This was what happened when monsters tried to be something other than destructive force. They became vulnerable. They made mistakes. They lost everything because caring created weaknesses. Enemies exploited with ruthless efficiency. But Cassian kept riding, because somewhere ahead in the winter darkness, Serafina was being transported toward execution designed to break him through public display of powerlessness, and he would burn what remained of the kingdom before letting that happen. Even if it meant becoming exactly the monster the aristocracy had always feared. Even if it meant abandoning everything he'd built to save one person who taught him that some things were worth destroying yourself to protect. The snow fell harder, erasing tracks and visibility, transforming landscape into hostile emptiness, where direction became guesswork and survival depended on instincts honed through decades of violence. Cassian rode through it all with singular focus. Behind him, Blackthorn Keep burned. Ahead, crown agents transported their prisoner toward political theater designed to demonstrate what happened when nobles defied parliamentary authority. And caught between fortress lost and woman stolen, Duke Cassian Raventhorn faced the choice that would define whether sentiment was strength or the final weakness that destroyed everything. He chose her, and that choice transformed him from ruler defending territory into something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose except the one thing that mattered more than power, position, or the careful reputation he'd built through years of calculated brutality. The aristocracy had wanted to break him. They were about to discover they'd succeeded. And broken things no longer cared about rules, consequences, or the careful boundaries that separated civilization from chaos. The winter forest swallowed Cassian whole as he rode south through darkness so complete that navigation became instinct instead of sight. His horse moved beneath him with labored breathing that suggested exhaustion approaching dangerous limits. But stopping meant losing ground on crown agents who had hours of head start and clear destination. Behind him, smoke from Blackthorn Keep stained the night sky with evidence of everything he'd lost in the space between heartbeats. Fortress compromised, forces scattered, power base destroyed through infiltration. He should have anticipated but missed because arrogance had convinced him that fear maintained loyalty better than gold. The mistake burned worse than physical wounds. Cassian had spent decades building reputation as the North's most dangerous duke, someone who governed through absolute control and strategic brutality that kept enemies at distance. And in one night, crown agents had dismantled everything by exploiting the single vulnerability he'd allowed himself to develop. He cared about Serafina Vale, not as political asset or strategic alliance, though both remained true. He cared about her in the way that made rational decisions impossible and survival instincts secondary to protection. The aristocracy had recognized this before Cassian fully admitted it to himself, and they'd used that recognition to destroy him with surgical precision. This was the lesson monsters forgot when they tried to be human. Sentiment created weaknesses that enemies weaponized without mercy. Love was beautiful until it became the knife that gutted you from inside while you stood frozen, watching everything collapse. But Cassian kept writing because the alternative was accepting loss as permanent, and something fundamental inside him refused to surrender. When surrender meant Serafina died alone in a show trial designed to break her publicly before execution. The forest thinned as dawn approached, gray light filtering through branches heavy with snow. Cassian's ribs screamed protest with every breath, damage from the 3-story fall compounding with exhaustion and blood loss from wounds he hadn't bothered examining. Pain was information. It told him he was still functional enough to matter. He spotted tracks ahead. Multiple horses, moving fast but not fast enough to erase evidence completely. Crown agents transporting valuable prisoner toward the capital, confident that pursuit was impossible because Blackthorn Keep was burning and its duke was either dead or too occupied with survival to chase. They'd miscalculated. Cassian had learned long ago that men with nothing left to lose became exponentially more dangerous than those still protecting something. The aristocracy had taken his fortress, his forces, his carefully constructed power. They'd stripped away everything except the one thing that mattered, and that made him unstoppable in ways they couldn't anticipate. The tracks led to a way station built for royal courier services, small fortified structure designed to shelter travelers during winter storms. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting occupied warmth inside walls meant to keep weather out and prisoners in. Cassian dismounted a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving through snow with controlled steps that minimized sound. His crossbow was loaded, sword loose and scabbard, daggers positioned for quick access. He'd killed men in worse condition than this. The question was whether he could kill enough before numbers became overwhelming. The way station had guards posted outside. 2 visible sentries, likely more inside. Professional soldiers wearing crown colors, alert but not expecting immediate threat, because who would be insane enough to attack a fortified position alone? Cassian circled the building, identifying sightlines and potential entry points. Front door was suicide. Windows were small and defensible, but the roof had ventilation gaps for smoke dispersal, spaces just wide enough for someone desperate and flexible. He climbed. The ascent took minutes that felt like hours, fingers finding purchase on frozen stone, while injured ribs protested with pain, sharp enough to blur vision. Cassian shoved the sensation aside and focused on movement, reaching the roof without alerting guards below who remained focused on ground-level approaches. The ventilation gap was barely wide enough. Cassian squeezed through, dropping into the way station interior with controlled fall that absorbed impact across shoulders instead of legs. He landed in shadow near the main fireplace, heat washing over him after hours in winter cold. The room beyond held 6 crown agents arranged around a central table where maps and dispatch papers lay scattered. And sitting against the far wall, hands bound but eyes defiant, was Serafina. She saw him before the guards did. Her expression shifted from exhaustion to something between hope and terror, recognition that rescue had arrived, but might cost more than either of them could afford. Cassian moved before rational thought could intervene. His crossbow bolt took the nearest guard through the throat, dropping him silently while the others were still processing intrusion. Second guard died with dagger between ribs, Cassian's blade finding heart before the man could draw a weapon. Third guard managed to shout alarm before Cassian's sword opened his chest in a spray of blood that painted stone walls crimson. The remaining 3 agents scrambled for weapons while outside guards rushed toward the door. Cassian grabbed Serafina and pulled her behind the overturned table as crossbow bolts hammered wood with impacts that suggested professional training and decent aim. He cut her bindings with movements fast enough to nick skin, freeing her hands while his mind calculated exit strategies that didn't end in death. There weren't many. "Can you fight?" he asked. Yes. No hesitation. No fear in her voice, despite circumstances that should have shattered anyone less practiced at survival under pressure. Cassian handed her a dagger from his belt. "Stay behind me. Move when I move. If I go down, run for the window and don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Then we die together. Your choice." The door burst open and guards flooded inside with weapons drawn and murder in their eyes. Cassian met them with violence that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with absolute refusal to accept defeat. His sword moved through flesh and bone with mechanical efficiency, each strike calculated to disable or kill before moving to the next target. Blood sprayed across his face. Someone screamed. Steel rang against steel with sounds that echoed off stone walls built to contain heat instead of deflect warfare. Cassian felt a blade slice across his shoulder, shallow cut that burned but didn't compromise movement. He killed the owner and spun to engage the next threat, aware that Serafina was fighting behind him with the dagger he'd given her, buying seconds that accumulated into survival. The way station became abattoir. Bodies fell. Blood pooled. And through it all, Cassian moved with the cold precision of someone who'd crossed beyond fear into territory where only objective mattered. Get Serafina out. Everything else was acceptable loss. The last guard fell with Cassian's sword through his chest, eyes wide with surprise that one man had just killed 8 professionals through sheer refusal to accept numerical disadvantage as determinative. Silence crashed down. Cassian pulled his blade free and turned to Serafina, checking for injuries with hands that shook despite desperate attempts at control. Adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion and pain in its wake. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but her eyes held something that looked like devastation. "You came for me. Did you doubt it?" "Boreas for something." "Yes. No, I don't know." Her voice cracked slightly. "You lost everything because of me. Your fortress, your forces, everything you spent years building, and you still came." Cassian pulled her close, pressing her face against his chest where heartbeat hammered evidence that they were both still alive, despite odds that suggested otherwise. The fortress can be retaken. Forces can be rebuilt. You can't be replaced. The admission hung between them, raw and honest in ways Cassian hadn't allowed himself to be in decades. This was the truth beneath strategy and political calculation. He'd chosen her over power because somewhere along the path from partnership to protection, sentiment had stopped being weakness and become the only thing worth defending. "We need to move," he said, stepping back. "Crown agents will send word when their patrol doesn't report. We have maybe 2 hours before reinforcements arrive." Serafina nodded, wiping blood from the dagger before tucking it into her belt. She looked different than the woman who'd stood in hunting lodges discussing corruption and partnership. This version had killed to survive and carried the weight of that action in her eyes. They took horses from the way station stable and rode east instead of north, avoiding predicted routes while moving parallel to Crown territory. Cassian's plan was forming through exhaustion and pain, strategy crystallizing around simple truth. He couldn't retake Blackthorn through military force. The fortress was compromised. His loyalists were scattered or dead, and Crown armies waited to crush any resistance before it could organize. But he could do something the aristocracy would never anticipate. He could attack the Crown directly, not through armies or prolonged siege, but through targeted strike that eliminated the leadership orchestrating his destruction. The council believed they'd won by destroying his power base and capturing Serafina. They thought the war was over except for mopping up isolated resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. Men with nothing left to lose didn't retreat into exile. They became weapons aimed at the heart of whatever system had destroyed them, and they didn't stop until that system collapsed or they died trying. Cassian intended to make the council regret every decision that led to this moment. They rode for 3 days through territory that transformed from wilderness to populated farmland as they approached the capital. Cassian avoided towns and main roads, moving through forests and abandoned estates while his body slowly failed under accumulated damage. His ribs were definitely broken now, grinding with every breath. The shoulder wound had reopened and was bleeding through makeshift bandages. Exhaustion pulled at consciousness with weight that suggested collapse was inevitable rather than possible. But he kept moving because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant Serafina died. On the 4th night, they sheltered in a burned-out manor house that had clearly been abandoned during some previous conflict. Cassian built a small fire in the ruined hearth, while Serafina examined his wounds with clinical focus that suggested medical knowledge beyond aristocratic education. "These need proper treatment," she said, probing the shoulder cut with fingers that were gentle but honest about damage. "You're losing too much blood. Infection is almost certain without antibiotics." "I know. And you're planning to attack the capital anyway." "Yes." Serafina was quiet for a moment, hands still working to clean and rebandage wounds that should have been treated by professional physicians instead of improvised field medicine. This is suicide. Probably, but staying alive while they hunt us isn't survival. It's just delayed execution. Cassian met her eyes in firelight. I'm going to the capital. I'm going to find the council members who orchestrated this, and I'm going to kill them publicly enough that the crown understands what happens when they destroy everything someone cares about. And then what? You'll be executed for assassination. Outsam. Ikina. Likely. But the message will survive even if I don't. Other nobles will see that defying parliamentary corruption doesn't end in quiet submission. It ends in blood that the aristocracy can't ignore or bury under bureaucratic language. Serafina's hands stilled. You're talking about starting a revolution through martyrdom. I'm talking about making my death matter more than my life. The Northern Territories will remember Duke Cassian Raventhorn as the man who refused to accept corruption as inevitable. That's worth more than dying quietly in exile while the council celebrates victory. What about me? The question came out quieter than intended. You extract me from captivity just to abandon me for symbolic violence? Cassian pulled her hands away from bandaging and held them with grip tight enough to communicate absolute certainty. You're not being abandoned. You're getting passage to the eastern provinces where my mother's family maintains estates outside crown jurisdiction. They'll provide sanctuary and protection until the political situation stabilizes. And you expect me to hide while you commit suicide attacking the capital? I expect you to survive. That's all that matters. Serafina jerked her hands free, anger finally breaking through composed exterior. You don't get to decide what matters for me. You don't get to sacrifice yourself while claiming its protection. That's not partnership. That's you reverting to the same isolation that nearly destroyed you before we met. Serafina, no, listen to me. Her voice carried steel beneath emotion. You spent decades convinced that caring made you weak. Then you met me and started remembering what it meant to protect something beyond power. And now, the moment that protection becomes difficult, you're planning to throw your life away rather than actually fight for future together. There is no future together, Cassian said flatly. The crown will hunt us until we're dead or captured. Running buys time, not safety. At least attacking the capital accomplishes something beyond prolonged suffering. It accomplishes your death and my isolation. That's not victory. That's you choosing comfortable narrative over messy reality. The accusation landed like physical blow. Cassian stared at her, seeing truth beneath anger. She was right. Some part of him wanted the clean ending where sacrifice meant something instead of the complicated survival that required building new strategies and accepting vulnerability as permanent condition. Dying as martyr was easier than living as man who'd lost everything and had to reconstruct identity from ruins. What do you want me to do? He asked quietly. I want you to stop planning your death and start planning our survival. Together. The way partnership actually works instead of the performance you're trying to execute. There's no path to survival that doesn't end with crown execution or permanent exile. Uchi. Then we find a third option. We expose the infiltration that destroyed Blackthorn. We document the crown's use of assassination and betrayal. We force a political crisis that makes killing us more expensive than negotiating peace. Serafina moved closer. You're the most dangerous man in the Northern Territories. Start acting like it instead of embracing defeat because it feels noble. Why? Cassian felt something shift inside his chest, perspective realigning around possibility he'd dismissed as impossible. She wasn't wrong. The crown had won tactically by destroying his fortress, but strategically they'd created martyr narrative that could galvanize opposition if deployed correctly. And martyrs were more powerful alive than dead if they understood how to weaponize their survival. We'd need evidence, Cassian said slowly. Documentation of the infiltration, testimony from captured agents, something concrete enough that Parliament can't ignore or bury. We have Ashford. He coordinated the betrayal. If we capture him and force testimony, he'll be protected by Crown agents. Getting to him means penetrating capital security during heightened alert. Serafina smiled without humor. Good thing you specialize in impossible tactical situations. For the first time in days, Cassian felt something besides exhaustion and pain. This was the clarity that arrived when strategy crystallized around achievable objective instead of symbolic gesture. They couldn't retake Blackthorn through military force, but they could destroy the Council's credibility by exposing methods used to eliminate political opposition. "We need intelligence on Ashford's location," Cassian said, mind already racing through networks and contacts that might still be accessible despite his fugitive status. "Crown will protect him, but protection requires resources. If we identify where they're holding him, then we extract him the same way you extracted me. Through overwhelming force applied with surgical precision." That worked once. Replicating success against prepared defenses is exponentially harder. So we adapt. Find new approach. Use the fact that they think you're running instead of attacking. Serafina's expression held determination that matched his own. "You taught me that survival requires being willing to destroy everything rather than surrender. Now I'm teaching you that destruction includes comfortable narratives about noble sacrifice." Cassian almost laughed. She'd learned his lessons too well and was now using them against the very isolation he'd weaponized for decades. "This is insane," he said. "Absolutely, but insane is how we got here. Might as well commit completely instead of halfway." They spent the night planning infiltration that required luck, skill, and resources they didn't currently possess. By dawn, Cassian had identified 3 contacts inside the capital who might provide intelligence without immediately betraying his location to Crown agents. 2 were former soldiers who'd served under his command during border conflicts. The third was a merchant with gambling debts large enough that information became currency more valuable than gold. Cassian sent coded messages through channels designed to avoid surveillance, arranging meetings in locations that provided escape routes if betrayal became reality instead of risk. The responses arrived within 24 hours. Both soldiers confirmed loyalty. The merchant demanded payment up front but agreed to provide intelligence regarding Ashford's location and security detail, which meant they had 48 hours to prepare extraction before Crown agents rotated protection assignments and opportunity collapsed. Cassian and Serafina entered the capital disguised as merchant travelers, documents forged well enough to pass casual inspection but not intensive scrutiny. They moved through streets where Cassian had ridden openly just weeks ago with cavalry at his back and authority recognized by every citizen. Now he was fugitive, hunted by the same Crown he'd served for decades. The irony would have been amusing if circumstances weren't lethal. They met the merchant in a warehouse district where commerce happened in shadows, and questions were expensive luxuries nobody afforded. The man was nervous, eyes darting toward exits while hands trembled around the ledger containing information Cassian had purchased. "Ashford is being held in the Eastern Administrative Complex," the merchant said quickly. "3rd floor, ministerial quarters, guard rotation every 4 hours, 12 soldiers minimum. Crown takes his protection seriously." Vulnerabilities? Service entrance on the north side, used by kitchen staff and maintenance. Less secure than main access points. The merchant swallowed hard. "Duke Raventhorn. They're offering substantial reward for information leading to your capture. People are watching for you. Let them watch. Just make sure your observations remain expensive enough that betrayal isn't profitable." The merchant nodded and disappeared into the warehouse district like smoke. Cassian turned to Serafina. 12 guards minimum means we need distraction significant enough to pull resources away from Ashford's floor. Fire? Too obvious. Shamitz. Crown will lock down the entire complex at first sign of emergency. We need something that draws guards without triggering building-wide security protocols. Yoshigeche. Serafina considered options with the analytical focus that had made her dangerous long before partnership with Northern Territory's most brutal Duke. What about staged assault on different section? Force them to redistribute security while we move on Ashford during confusion. Cassian nodded slowly. Workable if we coordinate timing precisely. The 2 soldiers who confirmed loyalty could execute diversion while we penetrate north entrance. Assuming they're actually loyal and not Crown plants waiting for you to expose yourself. Assuming that, yes. Cassian met her eyes. This entire plan requires trusting people who might betray us for reward money that exceeds years' wages. If I'm wrong about their loyalty, we die badly. And if you're right, we extract Ashford, force testimony that exposes Crown corruption, and create political crisis that makes our execution strategically disadvantageous. Then we negotiate from position of strength instead of running like prey. Serafina smiled. I like the version where we don't die badly. Me too. Let's try to make that one reality. Ma'am. They spent the next day preparing with meticulous attention to timing and contingency planning. The two soldiers were briefed on diversion strategy. Escape routes were mapped. Weapons were acquired through black market channels that asked no questions as long as gold changed hands. And beneath all the preparation, Cassian felt certainty building that this was the moment where everything either crystallized into victory or collapsed into catastrophic failure. There was no middle ground. Either they extracted Ashford and weaponized his testimony, or they died trying and became footnotes in historical accounts about nobles who defied crown authority. Night fell across the capital with winter darkness that turned streets into dangerous mazes. Cassian and Serafina moved toward the administrative complex through service alleys and maintenance corridors, avoiding patrol routes while watching for surveillance that might indicate elevated security. The building loomed ahead, stone architecture designed to intimidate through scale and permanence. Cassian had attended countless meetings inside those walls, negotiating policy and defending northern interests against bureaucrats who viewed territorial autonomy as threat to centralized power. Now he was infiltrating the same building to kidnap a traitor and force testimony that would shatter parliamentary credibility. The transformation was complete. Duke Cassian Raventhorn had become the revolutionary the aristocracy always feared. The north entrance was exactly as described. Single guard posted outside, bored expression suggesting routine assignment instead of heightened alert. Cassian approached from shadow and dropped him silently, blade across throat before the man could shout warning. Inside, corridors were empty except for occasional servant moving between floors. Cassian and Serafina climbed service stairs toward third-floor ministerial quarters where Ashford waited under protection that was about to prove catastrophically insufficient. They reached the landing and paused, listening for guard patrol patterns. Footsteps approached from the left. Two soldiers walking perimeter route with mechanical precision. Cassian signaled Serafina to wait while he moved to intercept. The guards died quickly, professionally, with minimal sound that wouldn't alert others positioned throughout the floor. Ahead, Ashford's quarters were marked by double guards standing outside heavy wooden door. Cassian counted seconds, waiting for the diversion his soldiers had promised. Exactly on schedule, explosion echoed from the building's western wing, not large enough to cause structural damage, but loud enough to trigger immediate security response. The guards outside Ashford's door exchanged glances and then ran toward the sound, abandoning their post because protocol demanded investigating threats before maintaining static positions. Cassian moved. He kicked Ashford's door open and entered low, expecting resistance. The room was empty except for the traitor sitting at a desk, frozen in shock as Duke Raventhorn materialized from nightmare-made flesh. "Hello, Garrett," Cassian said quietly. "We need to talk about testimony you're going to provide." Ashford's face went white. "You're insane. You can't just—" Cassian's blade pressed against his throat, stopping objections before they fully formed. "I can do anything I want because I have nothing left to lose. You took my fortress, scattered my forces, and nearly killed the woman I care about. That makes you valuable exactly once, right now, as the person who's going to confess Crown's infiltration tactics publicly enough that Parliament can't ignore the scandal. I'll never— You will, because the alternative is dying here without anyone knowing what you helped orchestrate. At least testimony gives you the chance to survive as witness instead of casualty." Cassian's voice dropped colder. "Choose now. Cooperation or corpse. I'm comfortable with either outcome." Ashford stared into eyes that held absolute conviction and saw truth that shattered whatever courage Crown promises had purchased. "What do you want me to say? Soan Boshray? Gimkas." "Everything. How you were recruited, who gave orders, what methods were used to infiltrate Blackthorn Keep, names, dates, payments. All of it documented in testimony that destroys any pretense the Crown acted legally." Before Ashford could respond, alarm bells rang throughout the complex. The diversion had been discovered or the guard rotation had found bodies. Either way, time had just collapsed from minutes to seconds. "Move," Cassian ordered, pulling Ashford toward the door where Serafina waited with weapons drawn. They ran through corridors filling with soldiers responding to multiple alerts simultaneously. Cassian's blade cut through opposition with mechanical efficiency, while Serafina covered their retreat with crossbow precision that suggested extensive practice since entering partnership. They reached the service stairs and descended 3 floors, while pursuit thundered above them, boots on stone creating percussion that sounded like approaching doom. The north entrance was compromised, guards flooding through to cut off escape. Cassian changed direction, pulling them toward the main courtyard where crowds gathered during public ceremonies. Empty now except for patrol forces mobilizing to lock down the entire complex. Cassian grabbed a torch from the wall sconce and threw it through administrative office window. Flames caught on curtains and papers, spreading with enthusiasm that suggested the building was more flammable than architects had intended. Fire alarms joined security alerts and cacophony that turned organized response into chaos. And through the chaos, Cassian dragged Ashford toward the gates, while Serafina fought rearguard action against soldiers who were trying desperately to contain multiple simultaneous crises. They burst into the courtyard just as Crown forces sealed the main entrance, trapped between burning building and armed blockade with prisoner who held testimony capable of destroying parliamentary credibility. This was the moment. Victory or death compressed into seconds where decision determined outcome. Cassian looked at Serafina, saw determination matching his own, and made the choice that would define everything. "We don't surrender," he said. "Never," she agreed. And together, they turned to face Crown forces arrayed against them while flames climbed administrative complex walls and political crisis crystallized into confrontation that would determine whether defiance meant martyrdom or revolution. The commander of Crown forces stepped forward, sword drawn, expression caught between duty and recognition that the fugitives trapped in his courtyard had just transformed from tactical problem into historical inflection point. "Duke Raventhorn," he called across open space, "surrender yourself and the woman. Release Lord Ashford. Do this, and I promise quick trial instead of summary execution." Cassian laughed. It was the sound of man who'd crossed beyond fear into territory where only principle mattered. "Your promise means nothing. The Crown has already demonstrated how it treats people who expose corruption. I'm not interested in trials designed to legitimize predetermined outcomes." "Then you die here." "Maybe, but Ashford dies with us, and his testimony dies with him. That's what you're protecting. Not justice, not law. Just the comfortable fiction that parliamentary authority operates through legitimate means instead of assassination and infiltration." The commander hesitated. Trapped between orders and the recognition that executing Duke Raventhorn publicly would create martyr narrative the Crown couldn't control. And in that hesitation, Cassian saw opportunity. "I'm offering you a choice," he called out. "Let us leave with Ashford, or kill us, and watch the Northern Territories erupt into rebellion when they learn their Duke was murdered protecting evidence of Crown corruption. Either way, the aristocracy loses. Question is whether you want to be the man who pulled the trigger." Silence filled the courtyard. Behind Cassian, flames consumed administrative records while smoke rose into winter sky. Around him, Crown forces waited for orders that would determine whether this ended in negotiation or bloodbath. And standing beside him with blade drawn and absolute conviction in her eyes, Serafina Vale prepared to fight beside the man who'd taught her that some things were worth destroying everything to protect. The commander raised his sword. The commander's sword hung in air like judgment suspended between duty and consequence. Around the courtyard, Crown forces waited with weapons drawn while flames consumed administrative records behind Cassian and the certainty that this moment would define whether defiance meant martyrdom or something more complicated than simple categories allowed. Then the sword lowered, not in surrender but in recognition that some decisions carried weight beyond military orders. The commander's face held exhaustion that suggested he'd spent too many years executing policies he didn't fully believe in, and tonight had finally pushed him past the point where obedience mattered more than judgment. "Stand down," he ordered his soldiers. Confusion rippled through Crown forces. Several officers stepped forward with protests forming, but the commander raised his hand for silence. "I said stand down. Duke Raventhorn, you and Lady Vale have until dawn to leave the capital with your prisoner. After that, my orders resume and I will hunt you without mercy. Use the time wisely." Cassian stared at the man, searching for deception or tactical maneuvering. Found neither, just exhausted pragmatism from someone who'd calculated that letting fugitives escape caused less damage than creating martyrs in a burning courtyard while political crisis consumed parliament from within. "Why?" Cassian asked. The commander's expression didn't change. Because I was at the Northern Campaign 15 years ago. I saw what you did to protect supply lines during that winter, when half the army would have frozen without your tactical decisions. You were brutal and uncompromising, and you saved lives through methods that made ministers uncomfortable. I've spent years watching the council destroy better men than themselves through political maneuvering disguised as governance. He paused. Maybe it's time someone forced accountability instead of accepting corruption as inevitable. The admission hung in smoke-filled air while soldiers absorbed their commander's declaration that sometimes duty meant choosing principles over orders. Cassian nodded once. Acknowledgement between warriors who understood that honor existed in complicated spaces where loyalty to institutions conflicted with loyalty to truth. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me. Just make sure whatever you do with Ashford's testimony matters enough to justify the treason I'm committing by letting you leave." Cassian pulled Ashford toward the gates while Seraphina covered their retreat with crossbows still loaded because trust only extended as far as immediate circumstances allowed. They disappeared into capital streets, now filling with citizens drawn by fire and alarm bells, using confusion as camouflage while Crown forces maintained their temporary stand-down. The safe house was 3 miles north, abandoned warehouse owned by the merchant who'd provided intelligence. Cassian had purchased exclusive access for 48 hours, paying enough gold that questions became expensive luxuries the merchant couldn't afford. Inside, surrounded by crates and industrial equipment gathering dust, they finally stopped running. Cassian shoved Ashford into a chair and stood over him with blade still drawn. Seraphina barred the door and checked windows for surveillance while adrenaline slowly faded into exhaustion that made bones feel like lead. "Start talking," Cassian ordered. "Everything about the infiltration. Who recruited you, what they promised, how many agents were placed inside Blackthorn Keep." Yes. Ashford's face had gone gray with terror and recognition that survival now depended on absolute cooperation. "Lord Greaves approached me 6 months ago, said the council viewed you as threat to parliamentary stability. They needed someone inside Northern nobility who could coordinate infiltration without arousing suspicion. And you agreed because? Because my estates are drowning in debt, and the Crown offered enough gold to clear everything, plus immunity from prosecution for past financial crimes they'd documented but hadn't yet acted on." Ashford's voice cracked. "They gave me a choice between cooperation and ruin. I chose survival." Cassian understood that calculus better than he wanted to admit. The aristocracy specialized in creating situations where compliance became rational choice and resistance looked like suicide. Most people chose survival over principle when forced to pick between comfortable compromise and catastrophic defiance. He'd built a career judging men who made that choice. Now he stood on the other side of the equation, watching someone explain decisions that were cowardly and comprehensible simultaneously. "How many agents did you place?" 43. Soldiers, servants, even 2 advisors positioned close to your inner circle, all vetted by Crown intelligence, all trained to maintain cover until activation signal. Ashford swallowed hard. The plan was surgical. Wait until you were maximally vulnerable, then collapse your power base from within while external forces sealed escape routes. And Seraphina's capture? Primary objective. The council believed controlling her gave them leverage to force your submission. They didn't understand that you'd burn everything rather than negotiate when threatened. Cassian almost laughed. The Crown had analyzed him through frameworks that assumed rational self-interest governed decisions. They'd missed the fundamental truth that men who'd lost faith in institutions stopped behaving rationally when those institutions became adversaries. Who else was involved? Give me names, positions, every detail you can remember. Ashford talked for 3 hours, describing conspiracy that reached deeper into parliamentary structure than Cassian had imagined. Ministers, generals, financial controllers, all coordinating to eliminate Northern autonomy through methods that would never survive public scrutiny. Seraphina documented everything with borrowed paper and ink, creating testimony detailed enough that fabrication would be impossible to claim. By dawn, they had enough evidence to shatter council credibility and force investigations that would consume parliamentary attention for months. The question was how to deploy that evidence without getting killed before it reached audiences capable of acting on the information. Cassian stood beside the warehouse window, watching sunrise paint capital streets gold, while exhaustion pulled at consciousness with weight that suggested his body was approaching failure. Broken ribs ground with every breath. The shoulder wound had reopened during courtyard fighting and was bleeding through bandages again. Pain was no longer information. It was environment, constant presence that defined existence. He needed medical treatment, rest, and safety that didn't currently exist. Serafina approached quietly, carrying water and bread scavenged from warehouse supplies. "You need to eat," she said. "I need to finish this first." "Cassian," her voice carried steel beneath concern. "You're barely standing. If you collapse before we deliver this testimony, everything we've risked becomes meaningless. Eat. Rest for 2 hours. Then we figure out next steps." "What's up, Mount?" He wanted to argue, wanted to push through exhaustion and complete the mission before Crown forces located their position. But Serafina was right. His body was shutting down, and pride wouldn't keep him functional if biological limitations exceeded determination. Cassian ate mechanically, forcing food down despite nausea that suggested internal damage beyond what he'd been ignoring. The bread tasted like ash. Water helped marginally. "We need to get this testimony to someone who can act on it," he said between bites. "Journalists, opposition parliamentarians, anyone with platform large enough that suppression becomes impossible. What about the commander who let us leave? He demonstrated willingness to prioritize principles over orders. Maybe he'd be willing to coordinate protection while we arrange public disclosure." Cassian considered the suggestion. The commander was pragmatic, experienced, and clearly disgusted with council corruption. He'd also committed treason by allowing fugitives to escape, which meant his career was already destroyed if the truth emerged. That created aligned incentives where mutual survival depended on exposing the conspiracy completely. It's risky. He might have changed his mind now that immediate crisis has passed. Everything is risky at this point. Question is whether this risk serves our objectives better than alternatives. She was right again. Cassian had spent years making calculated decisions based on probability and advantage. Now he was reduced to choosing between bad options and hoping that pragmatism would somehow manifest as survival. "I'll send message through the soldiers who executed the diversion. If the commander responds, we arrange meeting in neutral location. If he doesn't, we go to journalists directly and hope publication happens before Crown assassins locate us." Serafina nodded and moved to prepare the message while Cassian allowed himself 2 hours of rest that felt simultaneously essential and dangerous. Sleep came hard despite exhaustion, mind refusing to shut down while threats remained unresolved. When he woke, Serafina was sitting beside him with expression that suggested news had arrived during his unconsciousness. The commander responded. "He's willing to meet tonight at the old cathedral ruins on the eastern edge of the city. Says he can provide security and coordinate testimony delivery to opposition leadership." Cassian sat up slowly, ignoring pain that screamed protest. It could be trap. So on. It could be, but it's also our best option for getting Ashford's testimony into hands capable of forcing accountability. They spent the day preparing for a meeting that would either secure their survival or end an ambush designed to eliminate loose ends quietly. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Escape routes were mapped. Contingency plans were developed for scenarios ranging from betrayal to unexpected Crown intervention. By evening, Cassian felt marginally more functional, though medical treatment remained essential if he wanted to survive beyond the next few days. His body was failing systematically, damage accumulating faster than willpower could compensate. But he'd survived worse through sheer refusal to accept defeat as permanent. They moved through capital streets as darkness fell, avoiding patrols and surveillance while making their way toward cathedral ruins that had stood empty since fire destroyed the structure during some previous conflict. The location was isolated, defensible, and neutral enough that ambush would be obvious before becoming lethal. The commander waited inside with 5 soldiers who held weapons but maintained relaxed posture, suggesting security rather than hostile intent. He looked tired, face lined with stress that suggested the past 24 hours had been complicated for everyone involved. "Duke Raventhorn, Lady Vale, I'm pleased you trusted my invitation." "Trust is expensive," Cassian said. "We're here because aligned incentives matter more than sentiment. You need this testimony to justify letting us escape. We need protection while arranging public disclosure. Both objectives align." The commander almost smiled. Direct as always, Yes, my position is untenable unless this conspiracy becomes public knowledge that validates my decision. I've arranged meeting with opposition parliamentary leaders who've been investigating council corruption for months without sufficient evidence to force formal inquiry. And security? What do my soldiers, loyal to me personally rather than crown authority. They understand we're forcing accountability that Parliament has been avoiding. He paused. There's something you should know. Lord Greaves and Minister Voss were arrested this morning. The fire at the administrative complex destroyed evidence they needed to maintain plausible deniability regarding the infiltration. With Ashford missing and you still alive, the council is fracturing as members scramble to distance themselves from conspiracy. Cassian absorbed the information with grim satisfaction. The Crown's strategy had depended on quick resolution that eliminated witnesses and buried evidence. By surviving and extracting Ashford, he'd transformed clean operation into messy scandal that threatened everyone involved. When do we meet the opposition leadership? 1 hour. They're gathering at a secure location where testimony can be documented formally. After that, publication becomes inevitable, regardless of what the council attempts. Cassian nodded and produced the paper Serafina had compiled, detailed confession that named names and described methods with precision that made fabrication impossible to claim. The commander read quickly, expression darkening with each page. This is comprehensive enough to trigger criminal investigations across the entire parliamentary structure. Half the council will face prosecution if this testimony holds under scrutiny. It will hold, Cassian said. Ashford provided documentation and corroborating details that create evidentiary chain too strong to dismiss as political theater. The question is whether opposition leadership has courage to act on information that will destabilize the government. They have the courage. What they've lacked is evidence concrete enough to overcome institutional inertia and political risk. This provides both. The commander looked up from the papers. You understand what this means? You're effectively triggering governmental collapse through forced accountability. The consequences will be chaotic. Chaotic is preferable to corrupt. The aristocracy has been rotting from within for decades, while everyone performed loyalty to institutions that stopped serving any purpose except self-perpetuation. Someone needed to force the reckoning they've been avoiding. What? The commander studied Cassian with expression that combined respect and something approaching pity. You've lost everything for this. Your fortress, your position, any hope of peaceful existence inside the system you're destroying. Was it worth it? Cassian glanced at Serafina, who stood beside him with the same absolute certainty that had defined their partnership from the beginning. She'd risked family, reputation, and safety to expose corruption most nobles accepted as inevitable. She'd killed to survive and carried that weight without flinching. She'd stood beside him when strategic withdrawal would have been rational choice. And looking at her now, Cassian understood what the commander's question actually asked. Was sentiment worth more than power? The answer was complicated and simple simultaneously. Yes, Cassian said, it was worth it. Not because the outcome is guaranteed or the consequences are manageable, but because some things matter more than comfortable survival inside broken systems. The aristocracy taught me that power without purpose is just violence wearing expensive clothes. I'm teaching them that purpose without power is still worth fighting for when purpose is genuine. The hour passed in preparation and final review of testimony that would reshape parliamentary structure. Then they moved through dark streets toward the secure location where opposition leadership waited with combination of anticipation and apprehension that suggested they understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The meeting took place in a private library owned by one of the opposition's wealthier supporters. Book-lined walls and comfortable furniture creating atmosphere more suited to academic discussion than political revolution. 3 parliamentary leaders sat around a central table, each representing different factions that opposed council corruption through various ideological frameworks. They were older than Cassian expected, faces lined with decades of fighting battles through proper channels that moved glacially when they moved at all. Cassian placed Ashford's testimony on the table between them. Gentlemen, this is comprehensive documentation of Crown infiltration tactics used to destroy Northern territorial autonomy. It includes names, methods, payments, and organizational structure detailed enough to trigger criminal investigation across the entire council. The eldest leader, a man named Lord Pembroke, who'd served in Parliament for 40 years, picked up the papers and began reading with focus that suggested he understood exactly what he was looking at. The silence stretched while pages turned and evidence accumulated into picture too damning to ignore or rationalize. Finally, Pembroke looked up with expression that combined vindication and horror. This is exactly what we've suspected for years but couldn't prove. Systematic corruption disguised as governance. Elimination of political opposition through methods that violate every principle Parliament was founded to uphold. He turned to his colleagues. If we publish this, the government falls. Not gradually, but immediately. The crisis will be catastrophic. The second leader, a woman named Lady Rothwell, who'd built reputation fighting financial corruption, leaned forward with intensity that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment her entire career. Catastrophic for whom? For the council members who've been enriching themselves while destroying anyone who challenged their authority? Good. Let them face consequences they've been avoiding through political protection. The third leader, Minister Harwick, who specialized in procedural governance, looked more cautious. We need to consider implementation carefully. Mass arrests, investigations, trials, all while maintaining governmental function during transition. The logistics are complex. The logistics, Cassian said coldly, are your problem. I've provided evidence. What you do with it determines whether parliamentary reform is genuine or just another performance designed to protect institutional power. Pembroke studied him with shrewd eyes that had witnessed too many revolutions to romanticize upheaval. Duke Raventhorn, you understand that publishing this testimony doesn't guarantee your safety? The council will attempt retaliation regardless of political consequences. I understand, but safety was never the objective. Accountability was. If I die forcing genuine reform, that's acceptable outcome as long as the reform actually happens. And Lady Vale, she's equally exposed to retaliation. Serafina spoke before Cassian could respond. I made my choices with full awareness of consequences. I'm not seeking protection or immunity. I'm seeking the same accountability Duke Raventhorn described. Whatever happens after publication is something I'll face without regrets. The three leaders exchanged glances that communicated volumes about respect, concern, and recognition that the two people sitting across from them had crossed beyond normal political calculation into territory where principle superseded self-interest. We'll publish tomorrow morning through every major newspaper simultaneously, Pembroke said finally. By afternoon, emergency parliamentary session will convene to address the allegations. By evening, arrests will begin. Within a week, the government you've fought against will be dismantled and rebuilt according to standards it should have maintained from the beginning. And protection for Duke Raventhorn and Lady Vale during the transition? The commander asked. Rothwell nodded. We can arrange secure housing and security details sufficient to prevent assassination attempts. After the crisis stabilizes, they'll face inquiry regarding the armed extraction from royal custody and subsequent actions. But given the evidence they've provided, clemency is virtually guaranteed. Cassian felt something release in his chest. Tension he'd been carrying since Blackthorn Keep burned, finally easing as possibility of survival transformed from fantasy into achievable objective. They'd done it, not cleanly, not without catastrophic cost, but they'd forced accountability that Parliament had avoided for decades. The aristocracy would fracture under investigations. The council would collapse under criminal prosecutions. And from the ruins, something better might emerge if the opposition leadership proved worthy of the opportunity. There's one more thing, Cassian said quietly. The soldiers who remained loyal at Blackthorn Keep during the infiltration. They deserve protection and recognition, not punishment for following a duke who was later declared fugitive. Pembroke made notes. We'll arrange amnesty and compensation for anyone who can demonstrate they were defending legitimate authority against Crown-sponsored betrayal. The infiltration itself provides justification for their actions. The meeting concluded with formal agreements regarding publication timeline and security arrangements. Cassian and Serafina were escorted to secure housing in a district where opposition maintained sufficient influence that crown assassins would face serious resistance before reaching their targets. The house was comfortable without being luxurious, furnished with practical efficiency that suggested temporary accommodation rather than permanent residence. Guards were posted outside while a physician was summoned to treat Cassian's accumulated injuries. The examination was brutal. 3 broken ribs, infected shoulder wound requiring surgical debridement, internal bleeding that explained the nausea and weakness. The physician worked with competent hands while delivering prognosis that suggested Cassian had been operating on borrowed time that was rapidly depleting. You need weeks of rest and intensive treatment. What you've been doing to your body would kill most men. The fact that you're still conscious is remarkable and stupid simultaneously. Chate. Cassian almost laughed. Stupid has been my operational framework for weeks now. Seems to be working. It's working until it kills you. Rest, medication, proper nutrition. Non-negotiable if you want to survive long enough to see whatever political revolution you've started reach conclusion. After the physician left, Cassian lay in bed surrounded by bandages and pharmaceutical interventions, while Serafina sat in chair beside him with expression that suggested she'd been processing everything that had happened since partnership began in a hunting lodge that felt like it existed in different lifetime. We survived, she said quietly. Barely, and only because enough people decided helping us served purposes beyond immediate self-interest. The commander, the opposition leaders, even some of the crown soldiers who could have killed us but chose not to. You were wrong about sentiment being weakness. It's what saved us when pure strategy would have failed. Cassian was quiet for a moment, considering the argument he'd spent years rejecting and weeks discovering might actually be true. I was wrong about a lot of things. I built fortress mentality around the belief that isolation equaled safety, and caring created vulnerability. Then you walked into my life and dismantled every assumption through sheer refusal to accept my definitions as inevitable. Serafina smiled, exhaustion making the expression fragile but genuine. I learned from the best. You taught me that survival requires being willing to destroy everything rather than surrender. I just applied that lesson to your emotional isolation instead of political institutions. And now we're both exhausted, injured, and waiting to see whether parliamentary reform actually happens or just becomes another comfortable fiction. But we're alive, together, with testimony that's going to force the accountability we fought for. She reached for his hand, holding it with grip that communicated everything language couldn't fully express. That's not nothing, Cassian. That's everything. He squeezed her hand gently, feeling the truth beneath her words settle into bones that had carried too much weight for too long. They'd lost fortress, forces, position, and every material advantage he'd spent decades accumulating. But they'd gained something the aristocracy couldn't quantify or destroy through political maneuvering. They'd gained partnership built on genuine trust instead of strategic necessity. They'd proven that caring made you stronger when the person you cared about shared your willingness to fight for principles that mattered more than comfortable survival. And they'd forced a reckoning that would reshape governmental structure regardless of personal cost. The next morning, newspapers across the capital published Ashford's testimony in full. Headlines screamed corruption and conspiracy, while citizens gathered in streets demanding accountability from leaders who'd betrayed public trust for personal enrichment. By afternoon, emergency parliamentary session devolved into chaos, as opposition leaders demanded immediate investigation and council members scrambled to create distance from colleagues named in documentation. By evening, Lord Greaves was formally charged with treason and conspiracy. Minister Voss followed within hours. 3 other council members resigned preemptively, hoping that abandoning positions would somehow mitigate criminal liability. The government was collapsing exactly as Pembroke had predicted. Institutional structure fracturing under weight of revelations it could no longer suppress or rationalize. And inside secure housing 3 miles from Parliament, Cassian watched the chaos unfold through reports delivered by guards who seemed equal parts horrified and vindicated by the spectacle. "They're calling you revolutionary," one guard said, delivering afternoon newspapers that featured Cassian's name prominently despite his fugitive status. "Some papers are celebrating you as hero who exposed corruption. Others are claiming you're dangerous radical who destabilized legitimate governance through criminal actions." Cassian read both perspectives with detached interest. Labels mattered less than outcomes. If parliamentary reform actually happened, and institutions rebuilt themselves according to principles they should have maintained from the beginning. He didn't care whether history remembered him as hero or criminal. 2 weeks passed in recovery that felt simultaneously too slow and preternaturally fast. Cassian's body healed under physician care, while political crisis consumed parliamentary attention completely. Opposition leaders moved aggressively to capitalize on momentum, passing emergency reforms that addressed corruption and reinstated oversight mechanisms that had been dismantled over decades. The council that had ordered Blackthorn's destruction was gone, replaced by temporary governing structure designed to maintain stability during transition. And gradually, conversation shifted from Cassian's fugitive status to questions about what should happen to the Duke who'd forced accountability through methods that were simultaneously criminal and necessary. Pembroke visited on the 16th day with news that formal inquiry had concluded regarding the armed extraction and subsequent actions. Parliament has decided that given the evidence you provided and the systematic corruption you exposed, clemency is appropriate. You and Lady Vale will face no prosecution for actions taken in response to Crown infiltration. Additionally, there's movement to restore your ducal authority over northern territories with reformed oversight that prevents future abuses. Cassian absorbed the information without visible reaction. Clemency was pragmatic decision rather than moral judgment. Parliament recognizing that punishing him would undermine the entire reform narrative they were constructing. And Blackthorn Keep, still standing, though significantly damaged. Crown forces withdrew once the council collapsed. Your loyalist soldiers have been maintaining defensive positions pending resolution of your legal status. With clemency granted, you're free to return and begin reconstruction. Returning to Blackthorn felt surreal after weeks of running and fighting and forcing governmental collapse through testimony extracted at gunpoint. The fortress appeared through northern landscape like monument to survival. Walls scarred by fire but still standing because stone endured when everything else failed. Soldiers lined the battlements as Cassian rode through gates that had been breached during infiltration. They saluted with precision that suggested discipline had survived chaos, loyalty maintained through crisis because some men valued principles more than immediate circumstances. Marcus waited in the courtyard, shoulders still bandaged from the crossbow wound but otherwise intact. He looked older somehow, face lined with stress that suggested the past weeks had been difficult for everyone who'd remained behind. "Welcome home," Marcus said simply. Cassian dismounted and embraced his oldest friend with grip tight enough to communicate everything words couldn't express. They'd survived. Not cleanly, not without catastrophic cost, but they'd survived when survival had seemed impossible. "Thank you for holding," Cassian said. "I know it was difficult." Difficult doesn't begin to describe it, but we managed. And now you're back with clemency and authority to rebuild according to whatever vision you think serves the North best. Marcus stepped back, studying Cassian with focus that suggested evaluation. "You look different." "I am different. Turns out losing everything teaches lessons that winning never could." They walked through the fortress together, surveying damage and discussing reconstruction plans. The East Wing needed complete rebuilding. The main hall required structural reinforcement. Supply systems had been compromised and needed systematic overhaul. But beneath the physical damage, Cassian sensed something more fundamental had shifted. The fortress felt less like prison built to maintain isolation and more like foundation for something that might actually serve purposes beyond demonstrating power. That evening, he stood on the battlements overlooking territories he'd governed for decades with Serafina beside him. She'd adapted to northern life with same determination that defined everything she committed to, learning systems and earning respect from soldiers who valued competence more than noble titles. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Cassian was quiet for a moment, watching sunset paint snow-covered landscape gold while wind carried the smell of smoke and winter cold. "I'm thinking about the man I was when we met, so convinced that isolation equaled strength and caring created vulnerability. I built everything around that belief, and it nearly destroyed me when the belief proved catastrophically wrong. And now I understand that strength comes from being willing to rebuild after collapse. From admitting mistakes and changing strategies when evidence suggests previous approaches were insufficient. The aristocracy taught me that power mattered most. You taught me that purpose matters more." Bams. Serafina leaned against the stone railing, eyes reflecting firelight from torches burning along the battlements. We both changed. I was so focused on escaping cages that I didn't realize freedom requires building something worth protecting. Partnership taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness when it's shared with someone who values your survival as much as their own. Cassian pulled her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing synchronize with his own. They'd walked through fire together and emerged scarred but fundamentally intact. The journey had cost fortress, position, and every comfortable certainty he'd relied upon for years. But it had given him something the aristocracy couldn't quantify or destroy through political maneuvering. It had given him partnership built on genuine trust. It had taught him that caring made you stronger when the person you cared about shared your willingness to fight for principles that mattered more than survival. It had proven that some things were worth destroying everything to protect, and protecting them didn't make you weak. It made you human. Below them, Blackthorn Keep continued its slow resurrection from ruins. Soldiers worked through evening repairing damage while servants prepared meals, and Marcus coordinated reconstruction. With efficiency that suggested northern territories would survive and adapt exactly as they'd always done. The aristocracy had tried to break Duke Cassian Raventhorn through infiltration and betrayal. They destroyed his fortress and scattered his forces and nearly killed the woman who'd taught him. That sentiment was strength rather than weakness. And they'd failed. Not because Cassian was invincible or because strategy was perfect. They'd failed because some men don't surrender when surrender becomes rational choice. They adapt, they rebuild, and they force the world to accommodate their continued existence through sheer refusal to accept defeat as permanent condition. What happens now? Serafina asked quietly. Cassian considered the question with honesty that would have been impossible months ago when image mattered more than truth. Now we rebuild. Not the fortress I lost, but something better that incorporates everything we learned through losing it. We govern according to principles that actually serve people instead of maintaining power for its own sake. We create the kind of leadership the North deserves instead of the kind the aristocracy tolerates. That sounds like revolution. It is, just slower and more sustainable than the version we forced on Parliament. Change that lasts requires building new foundations instead of just destroying old structures. Treats. And us? What are we building? Cassian turned to face her completely, seeing the woman who'd risked everything to stand beside a monster who was learning slowly and painfully how to be something more human. We're building partnership that survives beyond crisis conditions. We're proving that caring doesn't create weakness when both people value each other's survival as much as their own objectives. We're showing the aristocracy that some things matter more than power, and protecting those things doesn't make you vulnerable. He paused, searching for words adequate to express truths that felt too large for language. We're building a life worth defending, together, without apology or compromise to systems that demand we sacrifice principles for comfortable survival. Serafina smiled, exhaustion and determination visible in equal measure across features that belonged in marble sculptures, but were infinitely more beautiful, animated by intelligence and absolute certainty. Then let's build something the aristocracy will remember long after we're gone. Something that proves monsters can become human without losing the strength that made them dangerous in the first place. Cassian kissed her there on the battlements, while northern wind carried smoke from reconstruction fires, and stars emerged above fortress walls that had survived centuries of warfare. Behind them, Blackthorn Keep stood scarred but unbroken, testament to survival and adaptation and the absolute refusal to accept defeat, when defeat meant abandoning everything worth protecting. The aristocracy had learned what happened when they pushed northern territories past tolerance. They discovered that some men became exponentially more dangerous when stripped of everything except the one thing that mattered more than power. And they'd witnessed the birth of leadership built on purpose instead of fear, partnership instead of isolation, principles that served people instead of institutions, maintaining comfortable corruption. Duke Cassian Raventhorn ruled the north beside Duchess Serafina Raventhorn, two people who'd walked through fire and emerged fundamentally changed by the journey. They governed with brutal honesty about power's limitations and absolute commitment to protecting what mattered most. The northern territories thrived under leadership that prioritized effectiveness over appearance, accountability over comfortable fiction, and genuine partnership over strategic necessity. And years later, when historians wrote about the governmental collapse that reshaped parliamentary structure, they struggled to categorize the man who'd forced accountability through methods that were simultaneously criminal and necessary. Some called him revolutionary, others called him criminal. Most settled on complicated, recognition that people rarely fit comfortable categories when they're actually changing systems instead of just complaining about them. But in the North, where winter killed quietly and survival required brutal pragmatism, they called him something simpler. They called him Duke, leader. The man who'd proven that caring made you stronger when the person you cared about shared your willingness to fight for principles that mattered more than survival. And beside him, carrying equal authority and respect earned through intelligence and absolute refusal to accept cages as inevitable, stood the woman who'd taught a monster how to be human without losing the strength that made him dangerous. Together, they rebuilt what the aristocracy had destroyed. Together, they created leadership the Northern Territories deserved. Together, they proved that some things were worth burning the world to protect. And when winter came each year with cold that tested everyone's resolve, Blackthorn Keep stood beneath iron skies and black banners, fortress and symbol, and promised that some people don't surrender when surrender becomes rational choice. They adapt. They rebuild. They force the world to accommodate their continued existence through sheer refusal to accept defeat as permanent. And they do it together, because partnership built on genuine trust survives when everything else fails. The story that began with a duke who ruled through fear and a woman trapped by aristocratic convention ended with two people who discovered that strength came from being willing to rebuild after collapse, that caring made you stronger when shared with someone who valued your survival, and that some things were worth destroying everything to protect. Not because the outcome was guaranteed or the consequences were manageable, but because purpose mattered more than power, and protecting what you cared about didn't make you weak. It made you human. And humanity, with all its messy vulnerability and absolute conviction, was stronger than any fortress the aristocracy could build from fear and isolation.